Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Pikeville for those of you who braved the weather. And again, I will say the irony was not lost on us here today as we're under flood watches and warnings throughout different parts of Kentucky. I'm Angeli Dorsey, the Executive Director of AppalReD Legal Aid, and so I'm really happy that you all joined us today. For those who are on Zoom, there's a couple of housekeeping items I want to mention before I introduce our first speaker. Virtual attendees, if you have questions, we're going to try to have an alert. If you want to ask a question, raise your hand and we can unmute you. If that's problematic, you can also put questions in the chat function, and we have folks moderating the chat. For those of you who are here in person, I think most of you can see the restroom signs. Restroom is located. We'll have some refreshments brought in during the break time. Our pro bono team are here on site to answer questions about volunteering. Charnel, I think most of you know. Wave, Charnel. Yeah, Charnel Burton, pro bono, is here. And the pro bono team members are wearing that say red team, Amy and Pauline. So hit any of them up during the breaks or after the program to ask about pro bono opportunities at Appalade. And for the in-person folks, if you have questions, we'll raise your hands and we'll bring them to you to ask those questions so that the folks that are online can hear them. And if we have any issues with that, we'll just have the speakers repeat the questions before they answer them because the program is being recorded. One other thing that I wanted to mention, we have applied to the Kentucky Bar Association for 3 hours of CLE credit for this program. We're still waiting approval, so it's pending right now. With all of that out of the way, I am very happy to introduce you to one of AppalReD's pro bono attorneys to welcome you all here today. Last year, I learned that the president of the Kentucky Bar Association just showed up to volunteer at one of our pro bono family law clinics in response to an email blast requesting assistance from local lawyers. Rhonda Jennings Blackburn responded to the call to help her neighbors who needed legal help but couldn't afford a lawyer. Ms. Blackburn, our current KBA president, is an associate general counsel with Pikeville Medical Center, focusing primarily on risk management and litigation management. She was a trial litigator in private practice for 22 years prior to moving in-house in 2018. She's licensed to practice law in Kentucky and West Virginia. As an officer of the Kentucky Bar Association, she serves as a member of the board of directors of Lawyers Mutual of Kentucky. She is also a life fellow of the Kentucky Bar Foundation, which provides grants to organizations committed to strengthening our justice system and the legal profession. Rhonda graduated summa cum laude from Morehead State University and earned her JD from the University of Kentucky College of Law. She's also here to model our new pro bono volunteer shirts as well. So please welcome Rhonda Blackburn.
Thank you. That was a great introduction. I'm not sure if I deserve all of that. Greetings. I'm really excited. I hear there's a lot of you guys out there remotely, and that's a smart play. Keeps dry and warm, but we're all here for the same reason. And I'm not going to say too much because I'm here for the same reason you guys are here, is to learn how to assist legal aid with these overview disaster FEMA applications, anything that we can do to help legal aid with regard to that. So I'm going to learn alongside with you guys. When I became KBA president, you know, when I became aware of how much need there is with legal aid, and it's my commitment, not only with my own personal time, but also to promote that out there. And, you know, right now, you know, Pike County, Eastern Kentucky has been really hard hit, and they're going to need a lot of help there. But that need is not going to go away once we get through this crisis. And so once we get done with this part, you know, just keep in mind that legal aid continues and that they need to have our assistance, you know, forever, really. There's so much need out there. And any time that you can give to legal aid to help them in their, excuse me, help them in their work and help them in their purpose, that's always a blessing. My understanding is that as much time as you can give, however little, however much it is always going to be appreciated by legal aid. And just contacting them or your local legal aid society, they will put you to work and they will put you where the need is greatest. So with that encouragement, like I said, I'm not going to speak too long because I'm here to learn with all of y'all, and appreciate the opportunity, and also appreciate Pikeville Medical Center for giving us the space today here in person. We're happy to support this worthy cause. And I got a free t-shirt, so.
Thank you, Rhonda. And yeah, Rhonda made an excellent point too that I neglected in my opening. Thank you to Pikeville Medical Center for this space today and making for us to have this program in a hybrid manner. So it was also my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Whitney Bailey was an attorney in private practice prior to joining AppalReD Legal Aid in the summer of 2022. When she joined AppalReD, she was hired to start a medical legal partnership project, but had to almost immediately pivot the focus of her legal work in July 2022 to help survivors of the flood disaster that devastated this region that summer. When I arrived in Eastern Kentucky just over 18 months ago, she was the disaster response attorney and the only one that we had. And she helped to educate me about the ongoing need for legal assistance that the victims of natural disasters face for months, often years beyond the date of the event. Now she's the disaster response project director, and she's been instrumental in helping build and grow the AppalReD Legal Aid disaster response team that continues to serve the 2022 flood survivors with their ongoing legal issues, including many of those same people who were impacted again in the February flood event just a few weeks ago. Whitney is a graduate of the University of Kentucky and the McKinney School of Law in Indianapolis. Please welcome Whitney Bailey.
Well, hi everyone. While we're waiting for things to get rolling here with the PowerPoint, I'm so grateful for you all to be here with us in person as well as virtually. So thank you for taking the time to learn with us today about disasters and drafting a FEMA appeal, and then working into some of the issues that disaster survivors may have to encounter as they move through process, which is not easy and it is not quick. So, thank you. Perfect. Thank you, Paul. All right. All right. So as Angie was saying, my name is Whitney Bailey. I'm the Disaster Response Project Director, and this is my co-worker, Erica Fields. She is our disaster response attorney, and I am so grateful to have her support and to be able to bounce back and forth with her as far as some of the disaster legal issues our clients have to experience. So we will be going back and forth today with our disaster one-on-one and then how to draft an effective FEMA appeal presentation. So as Angie was saying, I was initially hired as a medical legal partnership attorney, and immediately when that executive director at the time said, hey, that was some FEMA appeals for a couple of weeks, short term, absolutely. A couple months later, I said, there's no way. This has got to be a full-time job. Mind you, I didn't even know what FEMA stood for whenever they asked if I wouldn't mind to kind of switch into a different role. So, you know, it does stand for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, if you did not know, or Google it like I had to after I was asked. But again, we are here for, happy that you are here today and excited to get rolling. So Erica.
Hello, everybody. I'm Erica Fields. I'm a disaster response attorney with AppalReD. I started my career as a public defender, and then I went into private practice for a little while, but I knew that my heart was in nonprofit, legal aid, that kind of world of practice. So I came to AppalReD. I was really fascinated by the disaster response attorney position. And I'm so fortunate to get to work with this great group of people who are so smart and just so empathetic and compassionate about what they do. And they've taught me so much about not only the legal material, but about being compassionate and empathetic. And I'm a better attorney for working with them. So and we're really glad to be here today to teach you all a little bit about what we do, which is disaster response lawyering. So what will this session cover? This session is called Disaster 101. The disaster world is a unique field of practice that not a lot of people know about. So we wanted to give you all a little background on what is a disaster, the statutory authority that lays out how we respond to a disaster in the United States, how a disaster is declared, sources of disaster assistance, and an overview of the current disaster, the current declared disaster in Kentucky, which is, of course, the February 2025 floods. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how attorneys can assist disaster survivors, common legal issues that survivors face, and where we can best connect with those clients. So, what is a disaster? We wanted to give you all some statutory authority for disaster declaration and the disaster declaration process, and for FEMA and all of the federal programs that come along with disasters, in case you all do need to do some legal research or anything like that. So the main law that we deal with as disaster response attorneys is the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act of 1988. We do not say all that. We just call it the Stafford Act. And there's the citation if you ever need to look back. Of course, we have the United States Code, and then we also have the Code of Federal Regulations, which really deep dives into how these laws come into play. So the Stafford Act defines a disaster, and it is a term of art. A disaster is a natural catastrophe which, in the determination of the president, causes damage of a sufficient severity and magnitude to warrant federal assistance. The Stafford Act also establishes the presidential disaster declaration process, and gives federal agencies the authority to manage federal disaster assistance at the direction of the president. Now, it gives any federal agency this authority, but as you probably know, FEMA is the workhorse in the disaster world. FEMA was not created by the Stafford Act. That's a common misconception. FEMA was actually created by President Carter in 1979 through an executive order. The Stafford Act just gave FEMA more work to do. And FEMA used to be an independent government agency, but it was actually absorbed into the Department of Homeland Security when that was created in 2002 after 9/11.
All right. So, as far as the disaster declaration process goes, we have weather. It's coming. It is happening. The governor may decide to declare a state of emergency. And side quest, real quick, there is a difference between a state of emergency and emergency declaration. States of emergency are declared by a governor, whereas the emergency declarations are part of it's a job that the president has to do. And for both of those, it can occur prior to the disaster or within a certain amount of time after or during the disaster. For a state of emergency, it enables government officials to take extra measures to protect the public and triggers anti-price gouging laws. You can seek state or federal funding aid for disaster response if it is warranted. And then those emergency declarations on the presidential side, you are able to get assistance up to $5 million. So if there are any kind of state capacity issues as far as funding or manpower goes, you can get up to $5 million with an emergency declaration.
All right, so a natural catastrophe has occurred as defined in the Stafford Act. What now? If more, like Whitney was saying, if more money and manpower is needed than the state can handle, the state will contact their FEMA regional office and request a joint state and federal preliminary damage assessment. Kentucky's regional FEMA office is located in Atlanta, Georgia. That will obviously differ if you are responding to a disaster in a different state. Local government representatives are often included in these preliminary damage assessments. The PDAs, as we call them, will determine the extent of a disaster, its impact on individuals and public facilities, and the types of federal assistance that may be needed. So after the PDA is completed and the state determines that the damage exceeds their capacity to respond, exceeds their resources, the state will submit a declaration request to the president through their FEMA regional office within 30 days of the incident. Finally, the president will issue a major disaster declaration for any natural event that the president determines has caused damage of such severity that it is beyond the combined capabilities of state and local governments. And a major disaster declaration opens the door for FEMA to come in and help out. So there are three main types of FEMA assistance: individual assistance, public assistance, and hazard mitigation assistance. As legal aid attorneys and volunteer attorneys, we will work with applicants for individual assistance. Public assistance mainly goes to state and local governments to help the community as a whole respond to the disaster. So now we have, what we have is the disaster assistance sequence of delivery. And there's a really handy chart going through kind of all of the entities that respond to a disaster. So we have, at the beginning, we have voluntary agencies and mass care. So first responders. I don't know if you all are familiar with VOAD, volunteer organizations active in disaster, but they will help send out people like crisis cleanup to just tackle those like immediate on the ground needs. And then of course, if you have home insurance, that's one thing you really quickly want to do after disaster is file that claim. Then if you are uninsured or underinsured, federal assistance comes into play and you can apply for federal assistance. And of course, the first line federal assistance that most people go for is FEMA. Now we're going to talk about, we're going to get pretty deep into the different types of FEMA assistance, but what you need to know for now is that there's housing assistance and other needs assistance. And then it's possible that some people won't get assistance from FEMA for a variety of different reasons. Then they can go to the U.S. Small Business Administration, which, despite its name, can give individuals disaster recovery loans. And they're low interest, payment is deferred for a year. It's a really good option for some folks. For a lot of more, low income folks, they may not have the repayment ability for SBA loans. So it's kind of just a case by case basis. And then after we've trickled down through all the federal assistance, and there's still unmet needs, we can work with people like long-term recovery groups to get volunteers, not only, need support for unmet needs, but emotional support as well. Because it is very hard emotionally to recover from a disaster, and we have to be cognizant of that while we work with our clients.
All right, so now as we're moving into the individual assistance part of our Disaster 101 discussion, we have the links here for a lot of the main individual assistance program and policy guide resources that are so important to have access to. I honestly refers the IAPPG as the FEMA Bible, because it really gets in depth as far as the different ways to go through some of the types of assistance and the eligibility requirements. In September 2021 and then March 2024, there were different memorandums that FEMA published that updated the IAPPG, and it expanded on ownership and occupancy. And then there were also some other updates in 2024 that cut a lot of the red tape that many disaster survivors were experiencing, and really help them to try to get through this process a little bit easier, a little bit quicker. But again, it is still a process. When that final link down there are a lot of acronyms, abbreviations, and terms in disaster world. So we went on ahead and added that to our PowerPoint, which will be available. And I highly recommend that you check that out as well if you're ever unsure of one of the acronyms that we go through here, or that you may see listed in one of your disaster survivors' letters even. So for individual assistance, we are going to be focusing in on individuals and households program, but there are other types of individual assistance with the crisis counseling program, disaster case management, disaster legal services, and then of course the state can always request that disaster unemployment assistance or DUA, or disaster supplemental nutrition assistance program or DSNAP. So disaster survivors apply for assistance through the individuals and households program. And we went on ahead and added in that citation you need to go for those application procedures. The IHP period of assistance is limited to 18 months following the date of the presidential disaster declaration, but it may be extended due to extraordinary circumstances. That is particularly important for their survivors who are residing in one of FEMA's manufactured housing units, or MHUs, or any disaster survivors who are receiving rental assistance, because you only get up to that 18-month period, even if you do not begin to receive rental assistance or reside in one of those MHUs for temporary residence. After it, you get up to that 18-month period, but again, may be extended. And something to clarify, survivors do not have 18 months to apply for assistance. Survivors have 60 days from the disaster declaration date to submit that initial application for assistance. 60 days, they've got the 18-month period of assistance, but 60 days to apply. Again, those application deadlines usually are extended, especially if the county emergency managers, judge executives communicate with the other state government officials. Hey, we need some more time. Our folks are not able to make it out to the disaster recovery centers. Please give us a little bit more time. And they're usually very, very accommodating. And then late applications for that FEMA individual assistance may be accepted for certain reasons. Again, that's something in the IAPPG that we will get into here in a little bit.
And I just want to clarify one thing I said earlier. If you are, on the ground helping a disaster survivor and you have questions, especially about FEMA, you probably don't want to go to Westlaw and look up the Stafford Act. You can, but it's just going to be a long process probably to get yourself back to the IAPPG. That's a really hard acronym to remember, because that's your more practical, like Whitney said, FEMA Bible on the FEMA programs that you're working with, how to get that person assistance, things like that. So now we're going to give you all a snapshot of the current disaster that we are working within, which is FEMA 4860DR. That's how all FEMA disasters are notated, with those numbers and then the DR. So this is a map of Kentucky. This is the current disaster declaration situation. The counties that are in like the salmon color with the X's, those are getting individual assistance. So those are the counties that we're really honed in on to help those folks out. So the name of the disaster, they always have big long names, is the Kentucky Severe Storm Straight Line Wind, Flooding, Landslides, and Mudslides. And the incident period was February the 14th through March the 7th. Valentine's Day is when the initial real heavy rain and flooding started, and it kind of, as you know, can go on and cause mudslides and things like that. So on February the 15th, a state of emergency was declared. And on February 24th, the president did declare a major disaster. There are 16 designated counties in Kentucky for FEMA individual assistance, as we saw on that map. Not all of them are in AppalReD service area. Simpson County is in Kentucky Legal Aid service area, and Woodford County is in legal aid at the Bluegrass. And all of this information is on FEMA.gov if you all want to go and look at it at any point. It's really helpful. When are attorneys needed in a disaster? So this is a chart that that you will see really often in the disaster world. Disaster recovery starts the day of the disaster, but it can go on for years. And we have a speaker this afternoon, Christy Vick Stratton, who will go really in depth on legal issue spotting.
So these disaster legal services important. Disasters are increasing in frequency and cost. And since 2005, AppalReD Legal Aid service area has had 36 total declarations. So in the last 20 years, we've had 36 declarations, 14 of those declarations being in the last 5 years. 5 were emergency or fire management declarations, and then 31 major disaster declarations, and 15 of those having individual assistance available. Another reason why disaster legal services are so important, disaster recovery is inequitable. Folks, there's a disparate impact on low-income communities, the elderly, and other vulnerable groups like domestic violence survivors.
Now we're going to talk about where attorneys are needed, how we can connect with the clients that we need to connect with. The first option is a disaster recovery center. So a disaster recovery center is like a temporary field office for federal and state agencies. Who is there? FEMA, the Small Business Administration, certain state agencies, and legal aid. Survivors can apply for assistance, ask questions about FEMA correspondence, get copies of letters, and learn about all the other resources they can obtain to recover from the disaster. There are currently 18 DRCs open in for the current disaster, and the location and hours are on FEMA.gov. When we are able to get into the DRCs, which we're not as of right now, we hope to be able to table, and volunteer attorneys can come in and sign up for shifts and so help survivors kind of issue spot and figure out if they need to be referred to a legal aid attorney. Another place where we can connect with survivors is a clinic. So we can have a clinic virtually or in person. A potential topics for a clinic are FEMA appeals, landlord-tenant issues, drafting simple estate planning documents, things like that. We did a FEMA appeal clinic last week, I believe it was, and it went fantastic. We helped a lot of their survivors, and it was a really great moment. Our next confirmed clinic is May the 6th in Harlan County. So we hope to have some volunteer attorneys help out with that. And then if a survivor has a really, as we call it, spicy legal issue, we kind of refer those cases to a volunteer attorney or other community partner. If this is a situation where the person is going to need some kind of long-term assistance. There are certain practice areas where we really need some help after a disaster: title clearing, probate, insurance, mortgage issues. Those are all issues that disaster survivors can face up to years after the disaster. Okay, So that's the end of our first presentation. Spoiler alert, you get to hear from us again. But if you have questions for now, just raise your hand or drop them in the chat. We have someone monitoring the chat to let us know of any questions. We're getting like one golf clap.
Mary. Preliminary damage assessment. The question was, what does PDA stand for? And that stands for preliminary damage assessment. And it's a data gathering moment between the state and federal government to determine exactly what types of communities may have been impacted, if there were a lot of underinsured people or uninsured people living in poverty. Those are some of the statistics you might see in a preliminary damage assessment. Any other questions?
You turned it on, I turned it off. A question online, how much of what we just discussed is subject to change based on the federal government's current restructuring policies?
I am very optimistic, and we are going to keep it because we need FEMA. We need FEMA, and I enjoy working with FEMA, so I look forward to continuing that partnership. Yes, Mary? Yes. So the question was, will you have access to some of the resources we've been talking about? Absolutely. We will share the PowerPoints, resource checklists, templates, everything that we discuss or touch on. Absolutely. You will have access to it. We'll put it on our website as well as send an email out after within the coming week or so of today. All right, so we will keep it rolling. Okay. And then Paul, if you don't mind, thank you. Yes, drafting an effective FEMA appeal is the new session that we're going to dive into now. And Erica and I are just going to keep rolling. Right. So what will this session cover? We're going to be talking a little bit more in depth about FEMA individual assistance, eligibility, the different types of assistance, and then the application process. And then we will go into composing an effective FEMA appeal letter, because there is a difference. You don't want to just send something off to FEMA and let it sit. Ideally, it is effective and actually helps your disaster survivor. So with that, we'll be discussing managing client expectations, some of the reasons that you may want to submit a FEMA appeal letter, and kind of talk your client back into the process if they just want to throw their hands up. And then we will piece together an appeal at the end. So FEMA Individual Assistance, or IA, again with the acronyms, I know, but again, we will have that acronym link available after today's presentation. So FEMA Individual Assistance is provided through the Individuals and Households Program. And there are some general eligibility requirements in order for a disaster survivor to be considered for FEMA individual assistance. Things like citizenship, proving their identity, making sure that it's their primary residence that had the disaster damage, ownership, occupancy, any insurance that may come into play, and then some additional eligibility considerations are also out there for folks in situations like if you're in a roommate or separated household, military personnel, student if you are unhoused. You can take a look at the PPG or the Individual Assistance Program and Policy Guide for some of those other eligibility considerations.
Okay. So, one of the first, kind of gatekeeping issues that a client may face is proving that the citizenship status and their identity. So, in order to be eligible for FEMA assistance, an applicant must be a U.S. citizen, a non-citizen national, or qualified non-citizen. FEMA must also be able to confirm the applicant's identity. So how they go about this, they run a public record search with the information that the applicant provided. If FEMA can't confirm their identity, there are some alternative ways that applicants can prove to FEMA that they are the applicant, they are who they say they are. So these are some documents that people can submit to FEMA if FEMA is like, hey, we can't verify your identity. They can send any kind of document received from a federal entity like Social Security if the document contains the last 4 digits of their Social Security number. They can send a copy of their Social Security card, but it has to go along with a valid state ID or federal ID, payroll documents, military ID, marriage license if maiden name is an issue, because sometimes that can be an issue if someone has gone back and forth in last names, or their passport.
Hey, Erica, why is there a big red flag there on the slide? Well, y'all, whenever a disaster survivor experiences a disaster, if you are flooded or have a tornado or any other type, hurricane, any disaster, having these types of documents could prove to be very difficult and time consuming. You just experienced one of the most traumatic, overwhelming, and frustrating experiences of your life. And now you're telling me I have to figure out all this paperwork stuff just so I can get help. It's a little overwhelming. So again, red flag, some of your clients will be frustrated because of these documents that they will need to provide.
I was going to say, I don't know why the red flag is there because Whitney put it there. So I'm glad she answered her own question. Another kind of gatekeeping issue for eligibility for individual assistance, you have to prove ownership of the disaster damaged residence. FEMA must be able to confirm that you owned or occupied the disaster damaged property. Now, obviously, if you're a renter, if you rent a mobile home or something like that, you may or may not own it. And then at that point, you'd have to prove occupancy. And then along with kind of the ownership occupancy issue, whatever damage has occurred to that residence, whether it be an owned home, a mobile home, an apartment, things like that, the damage has to be the result of an active disaster. So if you have an oil fire in your kitchen on the day of a tornado and a disaster gets declared because that tornado was part of a big outbreak, you may not be eligible if you can't prove that the oil fire happened as a result of the tornado. And there we kind of get into kind of a chain of causation issue and things like that. But main point, it has to be a direct result of the declared disaster.
And to add to that, we are actually working with a client right now whose mobile home completely burned after it was flooded. And right now we're working through the appeal issue of proving that the electrical fire occurred because of the water damage to the breaker box. So that is a very real situation that we are going through. But one of the great parts of this disaster damage aspect here is that there was a part of that March 2024 update. There's an expanded habitability criteria. So if I really appreciate FEMA's slide here of explaining before March 2024, if a hurricane survivor had wind damage to part of their roof because of the disaster, but the other part of the roof was leaking before the disaster, FEMA assistance would only pay to repair the part of the roof with the wind damage because that was the disaster damaged part of the home. But now FEMA can pay for all of the repairs to the survivor's roof to ensure that the roof is fully repaired so they're able to actually live in their home. there are a lot of different documents that you can use to prove ownership if you do not have access to a deed, or if you are going through an area process with your home ownership. I know a lot of people in Eastern Kentucky or rural areas will have an issue of proving, because you might not have the usual documents like just a deed that's recorded in the clerk's office. So some of the other documents you could use are, land installment contracts, title for a manufactured home, court documents, property tax bill. And then there is an exception for mobile homes where you can draft a self-declarative statement. And there are certain phrases you have to include in that declarative statement, which we will provide you with our templates after this presentation. But another red flag here, y'all, again, if you've gone through a disaster, you might not have access or easy access to some of these documents. So we've already worked with several folks from the February 2025 disaster where we just had to go through this mobile home exception and throw in a property tax bill, and we're fingers crossed that that will do the trick for us in proving eligibility for individual assistance.
Yeah, the mobile home exception, particularly important in our area. A lot of mobile homes. I grew up in a mobile home. The airship issue also really important because in a rural area, homes can be passed down for generations without anyone even knowing how to do that, recorded transfer of ownership. So we run into that pretty frequently. And if you work with any survivors in our area, you may too. So more gatekeeping issues for being eligible for individual assistance. The disaster damage resident that the applicant is asking for money to repair has to have been their primary residence. It can't be their secondary home. It can't be their vacation home. A landlord is generally ineligible to apply for things like home repair assistance to repair the rental property unless they are also an occupant of the home. So occupancy, another gatekeeping issue. Applicants must be able to prove that they occupied the disaster damaged primary residence before receiving housing assistance and some types of other needs assistance. Certain types of other needs assistance don't require verification of occupancy of a primary residence. Like we talked about earlier, houseless people can qualify for some forms of FEMA assistance that don't require verification of occupancy.
Oh, another one. So again, there are a lot of documents that a disaster survivor could provide to FEMA to prove occupancy of their disaster damage residence. Utility bills, rent receipts, a public official document or letter that I have seen that, and that's also been very helpful. I've seen judge executives or magistrates write a letter. I know that this survivor there at the time of the disaster and for however many months prior to the disaster. Again, there's some certain language that you want to include with some of these other types of documents to prove ownership or occupancy, but we will provide a verification chart. It's also available in the September 2021 memo that expanded ownership and occupancy, but we broke it down so it's a little bit easier to digest. And once again, you'll see with the mobile home exception of a self-declarative statement.
So if you are someone who has home insurance or flood insurance, if your property was covered by insurance, you have to file a claim and FEMA will only pay for what's not covered. So if you are insured, FEMA is going to want to see that denial letter or, the explanation of benefits letter that says, hey, we'll pay for this, but we won't pay for this. That's when FEMA can come in and help. You cannot double dip. You can't get duplicate benefits from your insurance and FEMA. That will come back to get you. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Prior flood insurance requirement, we're going to talk about that a little later on in kind of crafting the appeal. So we'll skip that for now, but we did include this slide. It's a really important topic that we're running into quite a bit. So it was worth 2 slides. Okay, so here is our umbrellas. So there are two main types of FEMA assistance, like we talked about earlier, two main categories, we'll say. There's housing assistance and other needs assistance. Now, for fiscal year 2025, which we're in, there is a maximum for each category. For each category of assistance, you can only get $43,600 from FEMA, and that includes all these types of assistance that fall under those umbrellas. You have to add up all of the types of assistance that you've gotten, and you can't max out over that 43,600 figure in either category. You can. Yep. Yeah, there is a question, can you get both? Absolutely. Now, some people won't be eligible for housing assistance. Like we said, if you are a renter, that's a really common issue. Renters can get other needs assistance for like their personal property, things like that. So there are situations where it'll be one or the other, but a lot of folks will qualify for both and get both.
It is very tricky to hit the maximum amount for both types of assistance, but we were able to assist a survivor from the July 22 floods, and they almost maxed out on the other needs assistance category and did max out on housing assistance. So if, depending on what the needs are, that is definitely an opportunity. And we're thankful to have that for our
So one thing that was included in the 2024 FEMA update that's becoming more and more relevant in our digital society, especially as a lot of people work remotely, is assistance for computing devices. So before 2024, if you lived in a big home and there are 4 people and you had 4 computers, FEMA would only pay to replace one of those computers. Now, if they can prove, the importance of having all of those computers, FEMA may help replace all of them. And then self-employed people can now get assistance from FEMA to kind of help rebuild their small business. So we'll let you kind of just look over that chart. There's a lot of helpful information in the 2024 update document. Like we said earlier, max for both categories, 43,600, can max out in both categories. Some categories of assistance have their own limits, some of the types that fall under the umbrellas. So we'll talk about that next. So for rental assistance, this is when your survivor, their home is not livable, so they go out somewhere else and they rent somewhere to stay. You can get 18 months of rental assistance from the date that the major disaster was declared, not from the day that they applied. Rental assistance does not count toward the housing assistance maximum. It falls under that umbrella, but it doesn't count toward the total. And there's no monetary maximum for rental assistance. It's just that time period maximum. Serious needs assistance. So this is for things like food, water, baby formula, breastfeeding supplies, medication, other serious things that you lost it in the disaster, and like the next day you're like, I need this. You can apply for serious needs assistance. It used to be called critical needs assistance. The maximum amount of serious needs assistance that someone can get for fiscal year 2025 is $770, and that does count toward their other needs assistance maximum.
Like to say, if you work with any disaster survivors who say, well, FEMA only sent me $770, I didn't get anything else. That's just to get them started. So there's always usually more types of assistance available to those survivors. It is not just the 770 and they're done. That's when you need to encourage them to appeal. Look through your documents, through the letters that FEMA sent you, and we will keep moving through that recovery process.
Another great thing that included in the 2024 update, if you have a differently abled survivor, assistance for accessibility improvements does not count toward any assistance maximum. So FEMA will help them as much as they can to get their home back to a state where it's accessible. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the application process because it's good to have a background on how your client got to you, how your survivor got to you. So after a disaster is declared, the survivor has 60 days from that date to apply for FEMA, unless that deadline is extended, which it is sometimes in extraordinary circumstances. After the application is submitted, a FEMA inspector will contact the applicant directly to set up a date and time for home inspection. Before or after the home inspection, FEMA may send the survivor a letter saying, hey, we need a little bit more information. This isn't an outright denial, but we're going to need some more for you to come to the table. Then FEMA will send a decision letter to the applicant stating whether they were approved for assistance, and if so, how much. Now, FEMA recruitment. Remember earlier when I said if you double dip, it might come back for you. This is FEMA recruitment. If FEMA thinks you've double dipped, or if FEMA thinks you've used your FEMA funds improperly or committed fraud, applied for FEMA under someone else's name, they can try to make you pay back all that money that you got. It's very important to tell clients to spend FEMA assistance exactly as described in their decision letter. This is very important because this is where a very well-meaning person can go wrong. So if you received home repair assistance, you cannot go and purchase a dirt bike with that assistance. You want to use it to repair your home. Like it says, don't double dip on an auto insurance settlement and transportation assistance. You don't want to, perjure yourself and sign your uncle's name on a land contract 2 years after he's passed away. Another really important point, and this is kind of in flux right now, but there are certain categories of personal property that are not essential and will probably never be considered essential, and FEMA's not going to pay for those. FEMA's not going to pay to replace your PlayStation. I'm sorry. That's not essential, and FEMA won't help you out there.
All right, so managing client expectations. When you are meeting with a disaster survivor client for the first time or at any point, you need to be patient, kind, and you need to listen. Like we were saying earlier, this was a traumatic experience. So please be gentle. Let them tell you their story. This is their moment to vent, get it off their chest. I learned very early on in meeting with my survivor clients to not wear false eyelashes because I usually ended up crying with them. It was always a really hard meeting to have and to hear their story of being rescued off of their roof, or if a loved one passed away. We are people too. And with that, I would like to add, check in on your mental health. Your client's mental health is important, but your mental health is also important. So make sure you stay in tune with that as you work with disaster survivors. So you also want to be positive but realistic with your clients. It's not uncommon to receive more money, especially if the issue was a lack of supporting documents, and then you help the person correct the supporting documents and correct documents are being submitted. I always tell my clients, I can't guarantee an outcome because that decision is with FEMA, but I'm going to work with you to check FEMA's boxes and give them that paperwork. Attorneys are a lot like FEMA. We all like our paperwork. So, we got to have that in common and work through that together. Something else to tell your client is most clients will not max out on assistance unless they can prove it. So FEMA can only give that money for needs you can prove, regardless of how much you think you need or think you deserve. The purpose of FEMA assistance is to restore the survivor to a minimum living condition. It's not like damages where that is supposed to make you whole. And FEMA assistance is not a replacement for insurance either. So what are some reasons for a survivor to submit a FEMA appeal? Every applicant has a right to appeal, and it is not uncommon for survivors to get more money when they file an appeal. That initial application process can be really difficult to understand in general, especially for folks with cognitive impairments. I had a mudslide at my house from the February 25 storms. And I will tell you, this is my full-time job, and we spent a whole 15 minutes trying to work through the initial FEMA application process because my physical address is not the same with the 911 office and Google. The city and zip is different. So I can relate now to the disaster survivors where frustrating is it to not be able to just submit your address and move on? Another reason why it's important for a survivor to contact or maybe have an attorney is there are going to be some true legal issues. Yes, you can work through some of those other documents, but if you want to have that holistic client relationship, then working with them on clearing up that title to prove home ownership is really important, or working with them for estate planning documents, things like that. You want to meet them where they are and work with them as much as possible.
And just to point out, a survivor doesn't have to have an attorney to file a FEMA appeal. We can have a little pro se moment where they do it themselves, but it's really helpful to contact an attorney if you're unsure about anything. So how you analyze a FEMA appeal case when you have your first client sit down in front of you. First thing you want to do is review their decision letter from FEMA that says, hey, you got some assistance, here's how much, or hey, we're not giving you any assistance. If that client doesn't come to you with a decision letter, make them come back with a decision letter, because that's going to tell you what you have to appeal. That's the absolute first thing. You want to identify the issue. Why was the client denied? Or why did they get the money they got? And you need to, ask your client, do you want more? If you're denied, it could be because you didn't get this correct supporting documents, or it could be because FEMA found you ineligible for some reason, which, like we discussed earlier, can be corrected also.
So again, some common reasons for denial of assistance is proving that general eligibility, those general eligibility steps there. And we're going to kind of speed through some of these next slides so we can get into the meat of the presentation with actually drafting an appeal letter. So these will be available, but ownership, occupancy, those are really big ones for the initial denial letter. And then you also have identity. If you indicated that your property was insured, maybe you misunderstood the question, or maybe you checked the wrong box if you were submitting the application on your own. Another reason is if you missed the inspection with the FEMA inspector, they will send you a denial letter from that, but you can always call the helpline and say, hey, I need to reschedule. Usually not a problem. And then, of course, that prior flood insurance requirement will also come into play again for that initial denial. We've also seen that clients may get a home is safe to occupy letter, even if it's, water got up to the roof. That's contractor estimates are incredibly helpful to obtain, but it's difficult to obtain them, especially in rural areas, because there's a lack of availability generally. So something that survivors should absolutely get on top of as soon as possible is getting a contractor estimate and working, and you can always request a new inspection as well if you missed one. So prior flood insurance requirement, if you lived in a special flood, if the client lived in a special flood hazard area, which is a very good possibility here in Eastern Kentucky, and they received FEMA assistance in the past, FEMA may have placed a flood insurance requirement on their property. If they didn't have flood insurance at the time of the disaster, then they're probably not going to be eligible for FEMA assistance, whether they knew about this flood insurance requirement or not. The flood insurance requirement also runs with the property, not with the initial applicant. And and the applicant should be aware of if you were in a prior disaster and received FEMA assistance before, FEMA will let you know if you have a flood insurance requirement. Some of the tricky things are if you have clients who just bought a new house and it wasn't disclosed that they had a flood insurance requirement, we're seeing that. So we're starting to work through some of those issues and try to better understand how we can help survivors in those types of situations. So yes, they can still receive FEMA assistance if they had a flood insurance requirement and were not able to pay for it because they are very expensive, or if they weren't able to be part of a group flood insurance policy underneath the National Flood Insurance Program. And I know that part is not on the slide there, but it is a possibility to be looped into that if you get a new flood insurance requirement. And then here's a list of some of the types of assistance that you may still be eligible for if you had that prior flood insurance requirement and still need some type of FEMA help.
So now we're going to get in the fun part, making an appeal. An applicant has the right to file an appeal. FEMA should never discourage an applicant from filing an appeal. Important deadline, the applicant has 60 days from the date on the decision letter to appeal. Late appeals, not the end of the world, but best practice is to stick to the deadline. And we'll kind of get into the rest of this getting into how to draft. So before you submit the appeal, you as the attorney want to have the client fill out a release of information or ROI form and request the client's entire FEMA case file. And we do have a template for that we will share with you all. That can clue you in on what FEMA wants to see. They're sometimes slow at getting that back, but when you get it, you take a look at that really well. This is the appeal form that is on FEMA's website. You don't have to use this form. It doesn't go into the level of detail that we may want to go into with our clients. We'll provide our templates for pretty much every type of FEMA appeal that you will work with. Okay. And we'll get into this when we take a look at the appeals here in just a second. You want to use our templates. They're really good. We worked really hard on them. Don't reinvent the wheel and try to draft your own FEMA appeal. It's going to be a pain. So this is the first page of every appeal that you will submit. You want to make sure that you fill in all of the yellow parts. And you want to make sure the attachment section there at the very bottom, that's like the table of contents for FEMA. You want them to be able to look at that and get a good overview of what they can expect to see in this appeals packet. So make sure after you've gotten all the supporting documents, you fill that out and give them that table of contents.
After you have that initial cover sheet, you're going to include the FEMA's privacy data cover sheets, and we have that already pasted into our appeal template, so you don't need to worry about it. You will just print it off and it will be there. And you will want to have it positioned after the cover sheet and right before that release of information form. That is very important. Here is what the release of information form looks like. All of the light blue areas are areas that you can fill in. You've got the survivor's information up there at the very top, and then that section A in the middle of the page on the left, that is where you will want to put the survivor's information as well as your contact information if you want FEMA to send you the case file, or so you can clue FEMA in that you are allowed to discuss the survivor's FEMA matter with FEMA. Section B at the bottom of the page on the right there is you want to check all of those boxes and make sure you type or write in requests for entire FEMA case file. Again, all of this is in our templates, but just wanted to go over some of the best practices for that ROI.
And in our templates, this is kind of how every template starts, but we have a draft letter that either the client or the attorney will be the writer of that letter, and they'll go to FEMA. Can we go back to the slide, the facts slide? Yeah. All of our templates have these highlighted yellow sections. Those are the sections that you need to fill out. So make sure when you're submitting the appeal that all those sections have been filled out. We also have in big bold letters throughout our templates, insert ROI here, insert supporting documents here. So make sure that you're putting your supporting documents in before you send that appeal. So things like contractor estimates, mechanic estimates, insurance denial letters, things like that.
So I'm going to take accountability. I failed to send the correct PowerPoint to our person running it. So Erica had included a slide with the actual appeal letter in it. And I am just now realizing that it is not there. So that is on me, but we will provide those templates along with steps of how to go through each of those templates. We plan on doing some user testing within our office. I've put some feelers out there, so hopefully it'll be pretty easy to go through, but apologies for that. So once you do get the appeal letter together along with those supporting documents, you're able to submit that online in the person's disaster assistance portal. You can go in person to a disaster recovery center. You can mail it, you can fax it, you can do 2 or 4, whatever makes you feel warm and fuzzy inside on getting that appeal into FEMA. The general deadline is 60 days to submit an appeal after you receive FEMA's decision letter. And again, late appeals are not the end of the world. You include a statement to ask for an extension and provide a reason for that late appeal. Please waive the 60-day appeal window because I retained an attorney to assist me with my FEMA appeal. That's sufficient for a explanation there. And you will not need to provide supporting documents if you are requesting that FEMA waive that 60-day appeal window. Something that we think is important to point out also is the 18-month period of assistance for this current disaster in Kentucky, the DR 4860, Monday, August 24th, 2026. Your disaster survivors want to make sure that they have all supporting documents and appeal letters submitted to FEMA by that date. It's again possible to get an extension of the 18-month period of assistance, but it's very difficult. So just make sure you have it all in there. And if you need to request the survivor's FEMA case file after that 18-month period to review and make sure, hey, it's all there, FEMA, I think you missed something, you can do that. And we were able to successfully help survivors get tens of thousands of dollars more with some of those later appeals or asking FEMA to re-review a couple of their decisions. Yes. Absolutely. So the question is the need ongoing? Do you have to file multiple FEMA applications? Yes. So there's no limit to how many appeals you submit. You ideally want to try to knock everything out from that first one just to get it done. But there's a good chance, even if you submit the contractor estimate and your homeowner's insurance documents or whatever other supporting documents, there's a very good chance FEMA's not going to give you that help you still are eligible for, and you just kind of have to keep pushing. Oh, are you applications for FEMA assistance or appeal letters? Got you. I see. So you submit a single app, like that initial application to FEMA. You file your application, say, hey, I'm a disaster survivor, I need help. And then anything that you send to FEMA after that is an appeal. Even if you are not requesting, if your car got damaged and you didn't say that in your application, you will submit a transportation assistance appeal letter. So it's all appeals after you get that initial application in. Good question. Devin? Yes. So the question is, can renters still receive rental assistance if their rental home was damaged or destroyed by a disaster? Yes, you can.
There's also a thing called displacement assistance that FEMA offers as well. That's if you can't find like a kind of a more long-term rental and your home is not livable and you go stay in a hotel or with family or something like that. You can get displacement assistance to help offset those costs.
What other questions might you have? It's a lot. Angie. So some other non-essential items that people might request personal property assistance for: a fence, your fence that goes around your backyard. That's not essential. Even if you have a dog, that is not essential property. I can think of the list of essential property. So a lot of ADA property. If you had a lift, a chair, like reclining chair lift, that was an ADA approved chair or bed. And then, you have your basic towels, furniture, appliances, and clothes. Those are some essential items. Yes, all ADA, pretty much every ADA thing is essential from what I've seen at least.
Also, oh, go. What do we mean by separated house?
So a separated household, oh golly, I am blanking on that, but I do know that in the IAPPG for the let me go back here. I know exactly where it's at, but I do not recall off the top of my head what that definition is. So chapter 3, section 2B will have that additional eligibility consideration, and it will define what a separated household is.
One final question from online. Is there a resource for homeowners to check and see if their home has to have flood insurance on it?
Great question. Very frustrating though. So there is a flood map portal available. Sorry. So the question was, is there a way to check if you have a flood insurance requirement on your property? Well, there is a flood map portal. You can type in your address and you can see if you are located in a special flood hazard area, depending on where the little red dot lands on the map after you type in your address online. And we're happy to provide that link for people to check that out. But that does not tell you if you actually have a flood insurance requirement. You could also try to call the National Flood Insurance Program, provide your property address or your name, and see if they may have had a policy in that property address or the person's name. But there is no easy way, to our knowledge, to check if you have a flood insurance requirement, which is really frustrating. I think something that could easily be added. But calling the FEMA helpline might be another idea to check in on something like that, especially if you've received prior FEMA assistance. Call the FEMA helpline and say, hey, I don't have my letters. I'm not finding them. Can you tell me what's in my old case file? So you've got a couple different ways, but no cut and dry way to find out if you've got that flood insurance requirement. Very good question. So I believe we're at time. Thank you all so much for hanging in there with us for this Disaster 101 overview and drafting an effective FEMA appeal. Again, we will make all of our resources, templates, checklists available to you. So hang in there with us. But thank you all so much. And here is Angie.
Thank you, Whitney and Erica. And I apologize for not introducing Erica when I introduced Whitney, because I thought you all had a separate presentation. We're going to take about a 15-minute break now and resume at 2:30 for those of you who are online. Those of you who are here in person, we have some cookies, snacks. I think there might be some drinks over there too. So feel free to help yourself. Does the mic work now? It's on. Okay, thank you. Okay, welcome back everyone for the second half of our program. I do have one important announcement that came through while the first session was happening. We did receive approval from the Kentucky Bar Association for our 3-hour CLE credit, including 30 minutes of ethics as well. So it's no longer pending. It's my pleasure now to welcome someone from our sister legal aid program in Kentucky, Kentucky Legal Aid. Lauren Andrini is the lead housing and consumer law staff attorney for Kentucky Legal Aid. After she received her law degree from Notre Dame Law School, she began at Kentucky Legal Aid as the Bank of America Fellow with a focus on rural housing work. Upon completion of her fellowship, she continued there as a staff attorney until her promotion into her current role. She's also an adjunct professor at Brescia University, where she teaches business law. She's also on the board of directors for Crossroads in Owensboro, an emergency overnight shelter for women and children, and a food pantry. So please join me in welcoming Lauren for the next part of our program.
All right, we'll see if my voice will last 30 minutes. Am I on? Can you hear me? All right, I'm going to take your silence as yes, and we'll see if I can figure out how to do this. So thank you for having me. Thank you, AppalReD and Whitney for inviting me to speak today. My name is Lauren Andrini, and I practice in Western Kentucky. We have 35 counties in Western and South Central Kentucky. My main focus is housing law and consumer law, and I first got involved with disasters when we had tornadoes come through Mayfield and Bowling Green in 2020 and 2021. So my main focus is housing. This presentation has been done before as a housing presentation, and I've crafted it towards disaster work as well, but feel free to interrupt me at any time. And I welcome questions or personal experiences or stories about anything happening here too. So we're going to talk a little bit about pre-disaster, immediate post-disaster issues, disaster-specific homeowner issues, as well as disaster landlord and tenant issues. And then finally, we'll get to Kentucky eviction law generally, just to go through what a forcible detainer looks like, as that's something that a lot of people have issues with after a disaster. So before disaster hits, this is just like basic stuff that I've started to tell people that I meet with that can help in a disaster and also in any kind of legal issue. So a lot of people sign a lease agreement and then never see it again. So if your client is a renter, they need to take a picture of that lease agreement and email it to themselves or put it in their iCloud, whatever way they have to keep an electronic copy of that, because they're going to lose the paper copy, whether they are in a disaster or not. Somehow those always seem to disappear. And I have had increasingly clients coming in and telling me, I signed my lease with my landlord, but they wouldn't make me a copy. They wouldn't give me a copy of it. So tell them you need a copy of your lease agreement. Even better if it can be digital. Same thing with a homeowner's or a rental insurance policy. Great if they can get a copy of that and have it somewhere digitally that they could access after a disaster, because as Erica and Whitney mentioned, it's really hard to hold on to that paperwork. Also, a fireproof, waterproof safe could be a good investment to keep all of those documents safe. Just a good rule of thumb is have your driver's license updated to your current address. This is something that when I encounter a client and they're showing me their ID and their license doesn't match, I say, oh, you should really try and get this updated. This is a preventative measure that can make things easier for them after a disaster happens, because if their ID matches their current address, it's proof that they live there. If you need copies of these documents after a disaster. So I oftentimes will have people that don't have a lease agreement and I tell them, do you get food stamps? Yes, they do. Then the food stamp office most likely has a copy of their lease on file. If someone has a recorded mortgage document, that's going to be on file in the county court clerk. So you can go there to get a copy of their mortgage if they do not have that document. Additional things that I've seen in disaster presentations, I'm also a HUD certified housing counselor. So this is something that's been discussed on trainings. You have to have a disaster plan and have ideas of where your family's going to go. This is talk to people about now that we're having more and more disasters. Signing up for community alert systems, 211, knowing that they can contact United Way to figure out where they can get help. something interesting that maybe people growing up in Kentucky already know, but I didn't know this. Moving from Michigan, we don't have disasters like y'all do here. So cleaning out the bathtub and filling it up with water. If you're not going to have water for a few days, you can use that to flush toilets, wash hands, etc. Fill pots and pans with safe drinking water. Generally, a 3-day supply is recommended, regardless of what the event is going to be, just because even if it's a flood or a tornado, you may or may not have access to water and utilities. My friend that lives in Paducah right now has been texting me. We've had a natural, I don't know if you've heard, we have some pretty severe flooding and tornadoes, and she lost power and her water is out. So that's been for 24 hours now. And so these are just things that it helps to talk to people beforehand, because once you're already talking to them after a disaster, it's too late. Also, if you're in a tornado warning or you think there's going to be a natural disaster, take a video of your furniture, of your house, a video or photos, so that it's easier to make claims if you have a renter's insurance or a homeowner's insurance policy after a disaster strikes. Okay, these are common housing related issues that we see post disaster. I'm not going to read you, you can read it yourself, but we're going to go over most of these. One thing we're not going to go over that I just wanted to mention is home repair contractor scams. I haven't seen these a lot in the disaster context, but I've seen them in the regular housing law context, and I anticipate the more we deal with disasters, the more we'll see these. A big red flag is if the contractor comes in from out of state. So if someone is a contractor from out of state, there are some nasty people that follow disasters around and crop up, take our clients' money and then disappear. Just do your due diligence. Tell your client they really need to investigate someone. If they're somebody coming in to help post-disaster and they don't own a business in Kentucky, they're coming in from a different state, we need to scrutinize that a little bit more than we would a reputable contracting company locally. Encourage the client to verify that the contractor is licensed and insured. In Kentucky, we have a way to do that for any trades like HVAC, plumbing, electrician, through the Department of Housing, Building, and Construction. So that's just like a website that you can Google it. You can Google, how do I know if my contractor's licensed? And it'll pop up. So you can encourage your clients to do that as well. Some municipalities have portals. So like the bigger cities, Jefferson County, Fayette County, have a portal where you can see who is licensed and insured in your community. Okay, so I've had a lot of people that just don't really understand how homeowners insurance works or how rental insurance works. So if you haven't dealt with these personally, you probably don't know either. And Whitney might disagree with me, but after hearing her presentation about how you don't want to double dip, that's not what I'm encouraging at all. But as Whitney and Erica mentioned, you only have 60 days from the disaster declaration to file that FEMA claim. File your FEMA claim first if you're not sure that your homeowner's insurance is going to cover everything in your house, just so that you file the claim. You can appeal it later or turn down the assistance if your homeowner's insurance comes through. Homeowner's insurance will generally cover the full cost to repair. Policy allows it, except not pre-existing damage, like if you're not taking care of your home, and not if they've already paid out an insurance claim and then you didn't fix the problem when they paid you. And that actually comes up more frequently than one would think. It's surprising how many people get that money and don't actually fix the problem. So that's a little thing to look out for. Flood insurance will generally only cover where the flood was. So if your house floods up to the 3 feet of drywall, your flood insurance is only going to cover the bottom replacement, which doesn't do a whole lot if you have to replace floor to ceiling. So your flood insurance is going to need to be supplemented, and there's CDBG. You can read it. So I'm not going to go through all the acronyms. You'll have to remember that, look that one up if you need it. But there's going to be other community funds that might be able to assist in the instance of floods that are not a direct individual assistance FEMA claim, but it's through the county or community. Okay, so how does homeowners insurance work? And I've had multiple people come to me and say, my homeowners insurance is stealing my mortgage company is stealing my money that I'm supposed to fix my house with. That's not what's happening. In general, if someone has a mortgage on their property, the check from the homeowner's insurance company is going to be made out to your client and to the mortgage servicer. The client's going to have to sign that check and mail it to the mortgage servicer. There can be different variations of this. Sometimes the check will go directly to the servicer, but in general, the mortgage servicer is going to hold on to that money. And then your client or the homeowner is going to have to prove this is the contractor who's working on it. Yes, they're licensed and insured. Yes, we're actually making the repairs to our house, and document that. If it's less than $40,000, which is most of our people's are going to be, then they can get some. But if you get somebody that has $200,000 worth of damage, they're not just going to get a check for $200,000. They're going to have to prove incrementally over time that they're actually making the repairs to their house. So if somebody comes to you and says, my mortgage servicer won't give me the money that I'm supposed to use to fix my house, just dial it back a little bit. And that's probably not the case. Probably your client is not following through to show them that they're actually making the repairs. Okay, so if you have a client who is a homeowner is destroyed in a disaster, or maybe their place of employment is destroyed in a disaster, they're not going to be able to be making that mortgage payment. The first thing they need to do is call their mortgage servicer and see if they can get into a forbearance. So FHA loan, absolutely going to give you a 90-day forbearance because of a disaster. Other types of loans may or may not, but almost every type of loan will give you at least some break if you're unemployed. So if a disaster impacts your employment, you can call and get in a forbearance. That doesn't mean you don't have to pay it back. It just means they're going to pause your mortgage payment, and then you can either pay it back in a lump sum at the end of the pause, or they'll put it at the end of your loan for when you sell your house or pay off your mortgage. In general, this can be bad for people because they're like, oh, I don't have to pay my mortgage for 6 months. That's not the case. You're still gonna have to pay it back eventually. But if you're in this crisis mode and you need a little break to get back on track, this could be an option for your client. Okay. Very briefly, if you've never dealt with foreclosure issues, Kentucky is a judicial foreclosure state. Sometimes people will be like, I missed my first mortgage payment. We just couldn't make it this month, or maybe it's the month of the disaster and they couldn't make their payment. They don't have to freak out yet. A officer is not going to foreclose. They cannot foreclose unless someone is 120 days delinquent on their mortgage. So unless they've missed 3 months of payments, no one's filing a foreclosure. And if they do, it's a violation of RESPA, the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act. Citations here. There's a lot of citations throughout this presentation, and Whitney's going to distribute these, I believe. So you don't have to take notes on all the statutes, but we also have a right of redemption in Kentucky. So that's just kind of a vague piece of housing law knowledge that you probably won't ever need. But in case you says, my home was sold at a foreclosure sale, is there any way I can get it back? We do have a little thing in Kentucky law that's called the right of redemption that says if your home is sold for less than 2/3 of the appraised value at a foreclosure auction, 6 months where you can redeem that for the purchase price that the person paid at the auction interest. So a bit more to it than that. The statute cited here. Unlikely to come up in the disaster context, but if you have somebody, hopefully this raises a flag for you and you can go back and check and see if this might apply to your client's situation. Okay, so we're just gonna talk through this scenario of what might happen when somebody lives through a disaster and they're a homeowner. So homeowner's roof is destroyed in a tornado. They can't live in their home. They need temporary shelter. They come to you asking, what should I do? Should they file a FEMA claim? The answer is yes. They should file their FEMA claim and figure out their homeowner's insurance is going to cover it. Unless it's totally that their homeowner's insurance is going to cover this in full and they don't have other possible needs from FEMA, which seems unlikely, they should always just file a FEMA claim and see how things come out and what is actually covered. How can they get a copy of their mortgage or proof ownership, assuming everything in their home is destroyed? This would be when you'd look to the county court clerk's office. This is also what I tell clients right now. We do a lot of like affidavits of dissent, which are supposed to be filed with the county court clerk, but oftentimes my clients don't want to pay the $40 to get them filed. So I keep a copy of those and I tell my client, take a picture of this and keep a copy of it somewhere electronic, because somehow those always seem to get lost. They can't pay their mortgage right now because they need money to survive. What can they do? Call their mortgage servicer and see if they can get put in a forbearance. Do they need to document damage, or will insurance do that? This is so many clients have come to me with insurance problems and say like, my insurance won't cover this damage. And I'm like, okay, well, what's your evidence of the damage? And they're like, well, the insurance company took the pictures. And I'm like, so you don't have any pictures? No, insurance did it all. Your clients need to be their own best advocate, and they need to have their own proof of the damages. In most cases, especially the big claims, the insurance company will come out and take pictures. But especially for renter's insurance or smaller claims, it's going to be up to your client to document that damage, and they need to do a good job of proving it. So this is why even better if before a disaster, they can take a video or a picture of all of their property that could be potentially hurt in the disaster, and then they have the before and after pictures to show the damage to that same property. Where should they go in the meantime? This goes back to what Erica and Whitney were talking about with displacement assistance and different options that they have in FEMA. Homeowners may need to stay with family and friends, but they may also be eligible for assistance through their homeowner's insurance. Some homeowner's insurance have like a loss of use or additional living expense claim that you can file with your homeowner's insurance that will pay for you to live in a hotel for a certain amount of time, or they also could potentially get FEMA assistance for that if it's not in their in their homeowners insurance. So they need to cover themselves and keep all of their receipts. Anything that they're purchasing after a disaster in order to live, anywhere they're staying in a hotel, or any expenses they have related to housing, they should document all of that, keep all of their receipts, and keep track of it all in case they need to turn that in for homeowners insurance or FEMA. All right, how are we doing with homeowners? We're going to move on to landlord-tenant. Okay, so Kentucky has 3 main sources of landlord-tenant law. This gets increasingly confusing as you get into it because it's going to be so dependent on the type of property you're working with. But we have the Uniform Residential Landlord-Tenant Act, which uniform, you'd think it applies everywhere, but if you do landlord-tenant law, you know that it does not. Then we have non-Universal Residential Landlord-Tenant Act. I'm going to call it URALTA, but I know people have varying ways they say that acronym. And then accompanying case law for both. And if you're dealing with some type of federally subsidized housing, there's federal statutes and regulations that govern that housing as well. Okay, so here is our list of counties that have URALTA and cities that have adopted URALTA. This was statewide, and then our Kentucky court system said that was unconstitutional. Now you just have to pick if you want it. So most counties and cities have opted not to have URALTA, which leaves a big mess. I tried to make this map so you could get an idea if this helps you with a visual. Anything that is filled in yellow is countywide. Anything that is circled means that there is at least one city in that county. So if you go back to this list, they're all written out. But if you need a visual, because I was just curious, how much of the state does this really cover? It's not very much, but there are some throughout the state, and hopefully there will be more in the future. You can get a list, a current list on kyjustice.org, so I put the link in there. Okay, so the reason this distinction matters and why we need URALTA statewide, which is my personal opinion, I'm not, Kentucky Legal Aid is not advocating for that, but I am. It's in the absence of URALTA, there's basically no habitability requirements. So if you live somewhere and you have raw sewage coming into your bathtub every time you flush your toilet, which happens a lot, the landlord doesn't have to do anything. So they don't have to fix it unless you have a lease agreement that says the landlord has to make repairs, or if you live in a URALTA jurisdiction. So case law basically says the landlord is under no obligation to repair the leased premises if you live in a non-URALTA jurisdiction. In URALTA, the landlord has specific requirements that are common sense, that you have to comply with building codes and applicable building and housing codes. You have to make repairs enough to keep the premises in a habitable condition. Sorry. Okay, so when they Google it, it shows, oh yeah, Kentucky law requires this. So then they're getting mad at their landlord and saying, I'm going to report you to code enforcement if you don't fix this. Then they call code enforcement. Then code enforcement says, oh, your house is actually uninhabitable. You need to leave today. And there's nothing we can do about that. So there's a big educational component here that people need to understand, that their landlord does not have a requirement to repair their apartment. And unfortunately, after a disaster, that's still going to be true. So in a non-URALTA jurisdiction, there's no requirement for landlord to make repairs. In URALTA, tenants have specific rights to demand repairs and terminate the lease agreement if the landlord fails to make them in a timely manner. So this would be important after disaster. If the home is no longer habitable, the tenant can give notice and say, we can't live here anymore, and they're not going to be obligated to pay rent. If the landlord fails to provide essential services, like such as water or electric, they can make that same demand and no longer be obligated on that lease agreement to pay rent. We do have in non-URALTA jurisdictions, which is where I practice. So all of my URALTA knowledge is wishful thinking. Like, I've studied these statutes, but I don't practice them day in and day out. But in non-URALTA jurisdictions, we have constructive eviction. So if the property is uninhabitable, the tenant can move out and is no longer responsible for the rent. Do they get anything else? Unclear. If they, what I is landlord will then change the locks and client's stuff is left inside and they can't get it back. And so in some cases, pieced together through case law, there is some relief in constructive eviction, but it's not consistent, and it's really going to be up to the judge or jury that case is in front of. In URALTA, if the property is destroyed by fire, act of God, then client, tenant can get out of that lease. If the landlord unlawfully excludes tenant from the unit, or changes the locks, or gets rid of all their stuff, takes it all to the dump, the tenant can recover up to 3 months rent and reasonable attorney's fees. So in a URALTA jurisdiction, if the landlord does something unconscionable, like switches the locks without terminating the lease or throws away all their stuff, the tenant is going to have some ability to push back on that. That is not the case necessarily in a URALTA jurisdiction, unless you have a legal aid attorney that's willing to really push back on it. And even then, it's hard to do because there's just not great case law. For security deposits, this comes up when people are not able to stay in their home because of a disaster. In non-URALTA, it's contract law. You got to see their lease agreement if they're entitled to that security deposit. In URALTA, there's specific requirements, the statutes there, and for time purposes, I'm going to skip over that, and you can go read it when that comes up in your life. Landlord-tenant scenario. I'm going to skip these two because I want to get to the elements of a forcible detainer case, and I'm talking too long. So this is going to come up if you, and this is applicable during a disaster, not during a disaster. This is what I do every single day, is forcible detainers and evictions. So these are the elements of a forcible detainer case. We're going to run through them. In URALTA jurisdictions, generally 7 days notice is required for non-payment and 14-day notice for general breaches of the lease. These are further defined in the statutes. In non-URALTA jurisdictions, if you do not have a lease agreement, or if you do have a lease agreement, it can say whatever the lease is. In general, the minimum they can do is 3 days notice. But in if you don't have a lease agreement, or if your lease is your holdover tenant, you get 30 days notice. Federally subsidized properties is going to generally require 30-day notice, but some leases may provide otherwise for certain programs. Tenants must be served. They have to have 3 days notice of the hearing. So if landlord files on Monday and the hearing is Tuesday, you can ask for a continuance, or hopefully your judge knows that and isn't going to hold the hearing, but I've seen it done before. Notice must be personally served, left and explained with a family member over 16 years of age, or posted conspicuously on the premises. So most of the time, the sheriffs just tape this on the door. You have to have a properly filed complaint. So the complaint must be filed by the real party in interest, an authorized agent, or their attorney. The proper plaintiff or attorney must sign the petition. The thing I have this come up the most is unauthorized practice of law. So if they have an LLC or a corporation, the complaint must be signed by the attorney, not the property manager, owner of the property. Well, owner of the property is confusing. The owner of the property is an LLC or corporation. An attorney has to sign that complaint. It cannot be the property manager, or it's unauthorized practice. Same thing when they come to court. If they don't have an attorney and they're a corporation, that case should be dismissed. There's very clear case law on point. Oftentimes, I see judges continue those cases, but as long as they're not entering a judgment that day, we're okay. They have to have a valid basis to evict. So if parties have never had a written lease, generally the basis for eviction is just we're ready to terminate the lease agreement. But if a written lease did exist but has expired, there's going to be different rules depending on where you are and if you have URALTA or non-URALTA. Kentucky state law does not require good cause for eviction. So if somebody's sick of you living in their house and you don't have a lease agreement, or even if you do, most lease agreements, unless they're for federally subsidized properties, don't require any cause. They just require 30 days notice. Federally subsidized is going to be specific on the property, and either party has a right to an appeal. Tenants have a statutory right to a jury trial, but there's no discovery in forcible detainers. So if you're taking an eviction case and you think you're going to get wild, you can't get any discovery. So it's pretty tricky to do a big hearing. But there's ways around it. And clients, this is another reason why clients should always keep their documents. Special cases for domestic violence. If you have a lease agreement that says that the person can be evicted if they call emergency services, or can be evicted if emergency services comes to their property, that is not going to be true for a victim of domestic violence. So if a lease says that, that provision is unconscionable. It's contrary to law. And they cannot be evicted because they called the police when they were a victim of domestic abuse. So this is a relatively new statute. Every time I brought it up in court, the judge has not known about it. So it's just something to keep in mind, kind of beyond the disaster context. But if you're doing a forcible detainer and domestic violence is involved, pay attention to that. Eviction is not the proper remedy in a landlord or in a land contract case. So if somebody has a land contract and they put a down payment down, they're paying this off and they're going to get this land contract, and then the seller of the property goes to evict them, that's not a legitimate way to proceed in that type of case. They would need to foreclose on that property. And the case law there is Sebastian v. Floyd. Hotel motel residents may be designated as tenants in URALTA jurisdictions, but not so much in non-URALTA jurisdictions, but not in URALTA. In URALTA, only retaliation is prohibited. In non-URALTA jurisdictions, we don't have a statute or a rule against retaliation. If someone goes and says, hey, my property is not livable to code inspection, they're still going to be able to be evicted. Couple final notes on subsidized housing. 30-day notice is required in most, but not all cases. There's brand new guidance for subsidized housing. It is the Federal Register citation is there, and that's really new as of January 2025. So if you deal with any kind of subsidized housing evictions, check that out. Subsidized housing has better habitability requirements, and individuals with income loss due to disaster should inform their subsidized housing provider as soon as possible to get their rent decreased if they're going to have a loss of income due to a disaster. And if they've received a Section 8 voucher but haven't found housing and then a disaster happens, they may be eligible to get an extension to find that housing. So those are a couple of disaster-related things you might need. All right, that's it. Right on time. Perfect. All right, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, absolutely. But oh, yeah. Okay. So the question is, if a tenant has a contract and the landlord is, they're 1 month into their contract and they decide they really don't like this tenant, they can't just proceed with an eviction because they don't like them. The thing is, landlords in non-URALTA jurisdictions know how to get around this. They've created these leases that are so unfair to tenants, but the tenant signed it, so they agreed to it. So I've had people get evicted because like they didn't cut their grass enough, or they like just crazy reasons. Like they paid rent 1 day late and it was in the, I've even had them say, no, I did put it in the Dropbox on the date, but testifies, no, it wasn't in the Dropbox on that date. And we all know the landlord's lying, but when they lie under oath, like on the stand, what can you do? So in my experience, when a landlord is ready to get somebody out, even if they have a lease agreement, the lease agreements are so geared towards landlords and against tenants. The landlord's able to find some reason in that lease agreement and then say the tenant signed this and here's why. And a lot of our tenants, like, they make a mistake. They do something like have their sister stops by with her dog, and then it's like no pets. And then she's like, my sister only stopped by with the dog for 5 minutes, but they testified that there was a dog on the property, and the judge is going to say, too bad. So I think when a landlord wants to get somebody out, they're still able to. But yes, absolutely, the contract rules would apply. And if there's nothing in the contract, then yeah, I would hope they wouldn't get evicted. Anybody else? All right, awesome. I'm always happy to talk housing cases. So if you ever have questions, my email's on the slide. And thank you all again for having me.
The audio still working? I think I hit a button. Is it still working? Audio? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Lauren. Okay, our next speaker is also from Kentucky Legal Aid. Christy Vick Stratton is a graduate of Western Kentucky University and the Brandeis School of Law at the University of Louisville. She's licensed to practice law in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Christy began her legal career in 2003 and clerked for the late Honorable Margaret Huddleston, Warren County's first family court judge. In 2005, she began serving as an assistant Commonwealth attorney and served in that capacity until she began her service as an assistant public advocate with the Department of Public Advocacy in 2012. And in 2017, Christy joined the Bowling Green office of Kentucky Legal Aid. And in May 2022, Christy was selected to serve as the lead disaster response attorney to lead Kentucky Legal Aid as they assisted community members impacted by the December 2021 tornadoes. Christy also serves as the managing attorney for Kentucky Legal Aid's Bowling Green office. Please welcome Christy.
Thank you. Okay, so as I was setting over there watching everyone else speak, I talk with my hands. So if the microphone or the clicker goes flying across the room, I'm so sorry about that. But I'm so excited to be here today and speaking with you all about disaster. As she kind of mentioned in my bio, for those of you who are legal aid attorneys, you understand we always wear many hats. And so I do serve in different capacities at Kentucky Legal Aid, but primarily these last couple of years, I have been working on disaster response law for the December 2021 tornado survivors. It's been mentioned almost with every speaker. We are currently experiencing a natural disaster right now. So Tuesday evening, a couple of my coworkers and I actually spent part of the evening in the basement of Kentucky Legal Aid because there were tornadoes coming through our service area. And unfortunately, some of our counties have been impacted by those tornadoes, and we're just trying to see the damage now. As Lauren said, we cover the 35 counties in Western Kentucky, and we do know that there was some confirmed tornadoes. Not sure of the damage yet, but I anticipate with those tornadoes and the flooding that is ongoing and ongoing and ongoing for the last several days and this weekend, that we're going to have some more disaster legal cases that we're going to be working on. So today I'm going to talk to you about just some legal issue spotting after disasters. And so just to kind of give you a roadmap, we're going to talk about legal issue spotting first, short-term needs, mid-term needs, long-term legal needs. And then we're going to talk some ethics and what ethical responsibilities we have as attorneys when we're meeting with our disaster survivors. And then I'm going to encourage you to become a volunteer attorney, not only for AppalReD, who's sponsoring us today, who's facing a very recent disaster as well, the declaration. We also have one in Kentucky Legal Aid, one of our counties, but your assistance is always needed. So we're going to be talking about that a little bit as well. Feel free to interrupt me along the way. I love questions. It doesn't distract me. I want to make sure that we understand everything as we go along. And so, yeah, part one is our legal issue spotting. And just immediately after a disaster, you're not going to encounter people who are thinking about their legal needs just, the first couple of days after, because they're only thinking about food and water and shelter, our basic needs. That is what immediately comes to mind those first couple of days. How am I going to feed my children? Where are we going to live? What water are we going to drink? But after those basic necessities are met, that's when people are like, oh no, here's what's going on. These are my legal needs. Or they may not even know initially that they are legal needs. And that's where we come into play, just to help them with our legal issue spotting and meeting those needs. So, what can an attorney do after a disaster? So, initially, you can volunteer. You can go to a Red Cross location and help with getting those basic needs met. You may go to distribution centers, temporary emergency shelters. You just never want to be in the way of first responders. You want people to have that immediate medical need, the immediate housing needs met, offering assistance, but not at the same time being like what I'm going to refer to as an ambulance chaser. And all of the attorneys know what I'm talking about. That is not what we're doing. We're there to help. But then after the disaster come those other legal needs. And we're just going to talk about those in a little bit more detail. So the timeline for a legal disaster, the legal issues, you've got short term, and those occur weeks from the disaster. And then you have midterm that can be within 1 month to 6 months after a disaster. And then the long term, 1 year or more. So right now, what I said earlier is I'm assisting those who have been survivors of the December 2021 tornadoes. That's about 4 years ago, right? Well, 3 years ago, if you're doing the math, from December 2021. But there are still emerging legal needs that we deal with daily, weekly, monthly. So you may think, oh, well, there's been a lot of time that's passed. No, and we'll go into detail what some of those long-term legal needs are. But first, we're going to talk about short-term legal needs. And Lauren did such a great job talking about the housing needs for renters, the housing needs for issues for owners. So when I get to that, I probably will not go in as much detail because I do appreciate that she shared all of that. Some other short-term legal needs that come up are replacing important documents. And as Whitney and Erica mentioned earlier, you have to have those documents to receive some FEMA assistance or other assistance offered by community partners. So just helping clients find and replace those legal documents, explaining financial assistance information. They may have employment issues as well. They may not understand how to apply for disaster employment assistance, things like that. And so I'm just going to read through these briefly. Lauren did talk about them in more detail, but some of the immediate landlord tenant issues are the right to terminate a lease. Like, I can't live here anymore. Do I get to terminate my lease? The obligations of the landlord when the unit is unsafe to occupy, the requirements for a notice to vacate, the return of a security deposit, and when there's federally subsidized housing. And so those are some of the short-term legal issues that are going to come up for landlords and tenants. And again, thank you to Lauren for explaining that, as well as the immediate homeowner issues that come up. Title issues. What if they can't access, they don't have a copy of their title? What about their real estate contract? What if it's a rent to own situation? Rent to own are so confusing anyways to anyone. So throw that in, that there's been a disaster, and that can just create more issues. And then mortgage issues. And again, that's something that Lauren went through earlier. Our slides will be provided to you, and Lauren and I are both always happy to answer questions about any disaster, post-disaster housing issues that may arise. So some other documents that come up. So in the December 2021 tornado, I remember hearing about people who their checkbooks were found like counties over from where they live. So checkbooks, bank documents, all these other things. Your documents, there's a widespread tornado path and your documents could be anywhere. So that could be replacing an ID card or a driver's license, a social security card, a birth certificate, which I had to do myself recently because I only had the hospital birth certificate. It had a gold seal on it and everything. So I don't know, like I thought it was official, but it wasn't. So your clients are going to come to you and be like, look, it has a gold sticker. And you're going to be like, no, that's not what you need. And then a deed, any financial records, court documents, if there are custody orders in place, if there's a divorce decree that they have to provide proof of, you're going to help them replace those documents. And they may have their EBT card, and they're trying to get their food and they can't because they don't have their card. So all of those are things that as a disaster response attorney, you may be assisting someone with. And if these are things you don't know yourself how to get a copy of it, don't worry. Until I had to order my birth certificate, I never gave it a second thought. Reach out. We're happy to assist you with finding those, finding where you need to do, or excuse me, finding where you need to go to get those documents. A couple of things that we had come up after the December 21 tornadoes, people wanted copies of things that were important to them that you may not think about would need to be replaced. And so one of those was a Kentucky Colonel certificate. And for those of you who are appearing remotely in other states, it's a really big deal to be a Kentucky Colonel. So they want that in their office there, for the Kentucky Colonel's office. We're so great about working with us, and we were able to establish that this person, this individual, was in fact recognized before, had that document. And so they sent her a replacement one. And like just her joy about that was so sweet. So that was just something, you just have those little moments that just make your day brighter. And that was one of those for her and for our office, just because it was something, it was a document that meant something to her. You're also going to be faced with, where can our clients get financial assistance? And so Whitney and Erica did a great job explaining FEMA to you. And we've talked about insurance. Lauren talked about that. They may have insurance. They may be entitled to unemployment compensation. They may be entitled to SBA disaster loans. You may find personal individuals who say, I've got $5,000 and I want to help someone. That you know, you may see something like that. It may be a business saying, we've got this amount of money to donate to survivors. There's also Kentucky Emergency Management, in addition to FEMA, the Red Cross, the voluntary organizations, that's VOAD that was mentioned before, the long-term recovery groups. I know after the December 2021 tornadoes, those were formed in several of the counties in our service area. And I just realized I may be talking really fast, so I am so sorry. Just tell me to slow down, because I just get excited and I start going, and it's familiar to me, but I know some of you are taking notes because these are things that you've heard for the first time, and I want to be mindful and not just rush through these things. And a lot of times there are grants, community grants that individuals can apply for, to receive assistance after they're impacted by the tornado. So those are just a few examples of short-term legal needs. That is not all inclusive. You may find others. And then midterm legal needs, housing, consumer, and other. And we're going to go through those. And again, with housing, Lauren did such a great job, but you may deal with issues of clearing titles, when there's heirship property of, we all got this from grandpa, but there's no record of how we got this from grandpa, and just establishing that. And you know, through the presentation about FEMA, why it's important to establish that there's ownership in property. There may be some probate questions that come up with the death and who owns property. Mortgage relief, and again, FEMA, whether or not someone is eligible for FEMA. Some consumer issues that come up, and again, we'll talk about insurance a little bit, identity theft and contractor fraud. Those are some of the midterm consumer issues that come up. So for insurance, it could be car insurance, flood insurance, homeowners insurance, just helping individuals understand their insurance coverage. Before I started in this role at Kentucky Legal Aid, I really didn't understand insurance. Just full disclosure, as a legal aid attorney, that is not what I had to deal with. So when you don't know something, you find someone who does. And so that's why our volunteer attorneys are so important as well. They may be skilled and knowledgeable and only practice insurance law. So you bring them in to talk with you, talk with your agency, talk with your staff, and then get them to volunteer to take some cases as well, because that's their wheelhouse. That's the area that they understand. They may be disputing a settlement, a denial of a claim, appealing an insurance decision, just trying to help them navigate and understand, yes, this is your insurance responded appropriately, or if they didn't, here are the steps that we can take. Identity theft is also an issue. Lost documents, like I said before, your documents may be in a field 2 counties over. They may be waterlogged, there may be damage, or somebody may have gotten those. Somebody could pick that up in a field somewhere and they have all of your information and they're going on a spending spree. Now, I do believe in karma, and if somebody does that after a disaster, like, that's really bad, and something bad's going to come to them later. But lost documents, and then also when I was at the DRC locations, the disaster resource centers, people wouldn't even ask me why I wanted their information. I would say, okay, I need your social security number. I need your date of birth. I need all of this information. And they would just give it to me because at this point, they're exhausted from giving this information. So they're not verifying why someone needs this information. So someone may show up to their house and say, I'm with such and such agency. We have this service in place. We can help you. Give us your information. And if you've been impacted by a storm and you are a disaster and you've been impacted by all of the emotions and trauma that comes with that, you're not thinking and you're just going to give that information. So one of the first things that I've started to do is tell my disaster survivors is freeze your credit. Just go ahead. It's so easy. You log on, you do it, freeze your credit, and that way you're protected. So if somebody does find your information or you've accidentally through just being exhausted given your information to someone you shouldn't, freeze your credit, and then they can't go further with trying to open credit accounts in your name. Contractor fraud. I know Lauren briefly mentioned that earlier. Scammers come into town very, very quickly. I mean, day of, next day, they're there. They're rolling through your neighborhoods in their trucks and their what we call kidnapper vans in my family. They're rolling in their kidnapper vans and just trying to start getting information, start getting stuff from you. And so, and they say, oh, if you give me this now, I mean, your neighbors, there's 10 roofs over here, but if you give me $5,000, I'll do yours first. Like, you're that important to me. And they're in this crisis and they're seeing this like chaos and disaster all around them. So they're like, heck yeah, I want mine fixed first. And so they may then give their money to someone up front that they should not have. Contractors, and again, contractors are wonderful. There are some that do such an amazing job. We're thankful for them, but there are those who are shady and they won't complete the work that they've been contracted to do. So that could also be an issue that comes up. Or substandard repairs. They're going to use lower quality materials just to try to just slide something under there so they can get that job completed and move on to the next one, where they're also not doing what they're supposed to do just to be substandard and take the money and run. Other legal issues that may come up for disaster survivors. You may have immigration issues or family law issues. So immigration, replacing those important documents, that's going to be key for making sure that someone is entitled to benefits that they may be receiving, but also that they are here legally and there are no issues with them being where they're allowed to be. So no one can come in and say, I'm sorry, you can't be here. They can say, here are my documents. Yes, I am allowed to. I'm a citizen of the United States, things like that. And their status may impact what benefits they are or they're not entitled to. Family law, that's also another midterm issue that may come up. Domestic violence cases, a lot of times after a disaster, you're going to see an increase in domestic violence. Custody actions, you may have one parent whose home has been impacted where the child primarily resided, and now that child needs to go live with the other parent because they can't stay, they can't attend school where they had been going. So there may be a custody action to say, we need to modify this type of custody arrangement, or we need to change it. Or the reality is there may have been a significant injury by one parent and they can't provide the care to the child, and the other parent needs to step in and say, I actually know of a person that this happened to during COVID. Like, they were in a coma and dad had to come in and had to get a custody modification and had to modify child support, things like that, just because the other parent was not able to provide that support per the court order that had been in place. And so you may find an increase in those types of cases, even though you don't think, well, a disaster response, that's not disaster per se. It's not a physical, it's not a tangible thing that you pick up that's been destroyed, but there is a change in the circumstance of that family that requires some court action that you may be involved in as a disaster response attorney. And also obtaining guardianship over a child or an adult because the guardian or parent lost their life in the disaster. So mom and dad both could have been killed in the disaster, and they have 3 kids. What happens to those three children? Someone may need to come in and file for a guardianship action or another type of action to make sure that the child or the adult, if they are a special needs adult, that there's someone providing care to that child or that adult. So again, and I actually want to go back because another issue that may come up is in education law, and kind of that falls under the umbrella of family law as well. If you have a child that's moving from one school to another due to the disaster displacing them and their family, that new school may not follow an IEP. They may not provide the services that the previous school had provided for that child. And so you just want to make sure that you can step in and advocate for that child to ensure that their educational needs are being met as they're supposed to be. So again, that's another kind of midterm disaster issue that may arise. So long-term legal needs, and again, we've touched on these briefly. FEMA recoupment, foreclosures, bankruptcies, those are all things that you may see long term. So Whitney and Erica did a great job explaining what FEMA is and what those FEMA funds can be used for. You should always encourage your clients when you're meeting with them to document, because if they've requested FEMA for a certain thing, then that money can only be used for that certain thing. If they don't, then FEMA may come in and say, you owe us money. Now, odds are, if you're familiar with disaster legal services, either because you are already a legal aid attorney or you are already volunteering, you know that that money's not there. So if FEMA comes in and says, okay, we gave you $3,000 for this, we want you to show us that you spent $3,000 on that, and your client may have bought the dirt bike that they referenced before and didn't use the money for what they were supposed to, then they're going to have to pay that back. But if they use the money like they were supposed to do and they have their receipts, then all you do is say, okay, FEMA, here are the receipts. This documents you granted me money for this, and this is the way that I used it exactly like you told me that this money should be used. And so it's so important with FEMA recoupment to document and encourage your clients to keep records. Post-disaster, you're probably not thinking about that. Your clients are not thinking about that, I should say. But that's so important that they keep records of what they're spending their money on. Foreclosures, and Lauren talked about this earlier. It's so important to communicate with your mortgage company, to look for government assistance if you're unable to pay for your mortgage, just to say what other programs are out there. While we focus a lot on FEMA, there are other options out there for homeowners, and try to look under every rock to see what your clients may be eligible to receive. And also, you can agree in a foreclosure action to exchange the debt for the foreclosure in exchange for the debt being deemed satisfied. That's something as well. But again, Lauren went through all of those earlier with housing, and we're happy to provide some additional information on that if needed. And you may find that your clients have not recovered from the disaster. Financially, their home may have been impacted. They may have lost their job. They've been displaced. It's just impacted them across the board. And try as they may, let's say your business has been damaged, your employer's business, and they just say, you know what? We can't afford to reopen. We're not going to start again. We're not going to rebuild in this community. So then what happens? They don't have their job. They can't find another job. And it just kind of like the domino effect. Once one thing happens, another thing happens, and another thing happens. And so they may come to you 3 years later and say, I've never been able to recover since the flood. I've never been able to recover since the tornadoes. And then that's when you go through the options of, is Chapter 7 bankruptcy something that you and your family need to consider? Is Chapter 13 an option that you need to consider? So again, these are things that occur down the road. I was going to say 1 to 3 years, but it's 1 year, multiple years after the disaster. So that kind of takes me through. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but just some of the legal issues that are going to come up after after you have been faced, or your client has been faced with a disaster. So before I roll into the next portion of the presentation, does anyone have questions that I can answer about legal issue spotting after a disaster? So I don't see anyone in the room raising their hand. We're just going to say I did such a great job, right? And that's why no one has questions. Okay, so I'm running about 5 minutes ahead of schedule, but that is okay. We are going to talk next about navigating legal ethics in action for disaster cases. And so this is actually something that I modified from a presentation I saw by Neva Polly Scott. So I don't want to take credit for something that was not my original idea. But Whitney referenced this earlier. You've got to take care of yourself too. Disaster response attorneys have often been impacted by the disaster as well. So in our office in December 2021, we did have an attorney, well, a couple of attorneys and a social worker who were displaced from their homes because of the tornadoes. Would it make sense for us to just throw them into disaster work after that happened when they're trying to navigate? Do they have renter's insurance? Is their homeowner's insurance going to cover something? Is their family okay? How we're going to navigate all of this? No, that wouldn't make sense at all. So again, you've got to take care of yourself, but you prioritize their prioritizing disaster client care. You provide them in a way that is trauma informed. As Whitney said earlier, sometimes I'm putting this part in there. Sometimes we're very quick to rush through. We've got 20 clients, we've got meetings all day. We're trying to just sit through, just give me the information. You're telling me this much, I need this much information. I probably have said that before, not with a disaster client, but with a domestic violence client. You're giving me this, I need this. So was I trauma informed there? No. So I tell on myself all the time. But with your disaster survivors, they need an opportunity to share. They need to know that someone is listening and it is impactful and you will cry. So if you're wearing mascara, don't do it. Don't wear your fake eyelashes because you will have that moment when they're sharing this with you. It's life impacting, it's trauma impacting. So be mindful of that when you're talking with your clients, but we also want to engage in self-care. So after you have one of those meetings, maybe go get a coffee, maybe go talk to another coworker, maybe just whatever it is that you need to do. We all have responses in our own way of how we deal with trauma. So just do that. It is squeaking over here. I'm so sorry. Okay. But you also want to promote the care of your colleagues as well. So if you know your colleague is going through something, reach out to them. All you have to do is send a quick text at times just to say, hey, I'm thinking about you today. Can I grab you a coffee too? Just something to you don't even have to offer coffee. You can just say, hey, I'm thinking about you. Just so your coworkers, your colleagues know that you care about them as well. And I just think that's so important. But we're going to talk about the Kentucky rules of professional conduct. So this is your ethics red flag that's coming up, which is very important. But lawyers have certain responsibilities. And as a representative of clients, lawyers more. Oh, I can't talk. I'm so sorry. We're going to blame it on the chocolate chip cookie and my sugar high right now with my coffee that also had sugar in it. But lawyers are advisors. A lawyer provides a client with an informed understanding of the client's legal rights and obligations and explains their practical implications. Lawyers are also advocates. We zealously assert the client's position under the rules of the adversary system. We are negotiators. A lawyer seeks a result advantageous to the client, but consistent with requirements of honest dealings with others. So attorneys get such a bad rap for not being honest, but see, we have to because it's in the conduct, it's in the code. And we are evaluators. A lawyer acts by examining a client's legal affairs and reporting about them to the client or to others. So those are the responsibilities as set forth in the Kentucky Code. I'm going to focus for a little bit on legal ethics and FEMA appeals, and then we're going to kind of talk a little bit more about some other ethical issues that may arise when you're dealing with disaster survivors and their cases. But we're going to talk about competence, the scope of representation, communication, declining or terminating representation, diminished capacity, and the Confidentiality of Information and Privacy Act of 1974. And a big thanks to Whitney because a big portion of this legal ethics and FEMA appeals is from her. So I appreciate that. But for competence, a lawyer shall provide competent representation to a client. Competent representation requires the legal knowledge, skill, thoroughness, and preparation reasonably necessary for that representation. So if you don't practice disaster law, how are you competent in it? Well, you come to trainings like this, and then there's also a website, ladrc.org, where you can find information about disaster law. So you want to be skilled in that. And like I said earlier, bring in people who know what you don't. It's always okay to say, I don't know. And so, like after the December 2021 tornadoes, there were lots of times I said, I don't know. And we brought in the people who did know to train us so that we were then able to provide, and then again, so that they could see the work that we do and why it was important for them to also volunteer with their services. But the scope of representation and allocating of authority between a client and an attorney. So, what we're going to focus on, and you'll see there's A, B, C, and D. Subject to paragraph C and D, a lawyer shall abide by a client's decisions concerning the objectives of representation and, as required by Rule 1.4, shall consult with the client as to the means by which they are to be pursued. A lawyer may take such action on behalf of the client as is implicitly authorized to carry out the representation. A lawyer shall abide by a client's decision whether to settle a matter. So, very important. You can never settle something that your client doesn't want you to do. Also, a lawyer's representation of a client, including representation by appointment, does not constitute an endorsement of the client's political, economic, social, or moral views or activities. So, just like Lauren didn't speak for Kentucky Legal Aid and their political or their thoughts on something, so you cannot do for your client. You're not taking that on. C, a lawyer may limit the scope of representation if the limitation is reasonable under the circumstances and the client gives informed consent. And that really comes into play with helping a client with a FEMA appeal. And D, a lawyer shall not counsel a client to engage or assist a client in conduct that the lawyer knows is criminal or fraudulent, but a lawyer may discuss the legal consequences of any proposed course of conduct with a client and may counsel or assist a client to make a good faith effort to determine the validity, scope, meaning, or application of the law. So, reading through all of these things, again, I know that you all can read. I'm sure you are familiar with these, but we all need our ethics. And so, I want to make sure that we're focusing on that so you get that. And I'm going to just do something really quickly. Spotlight. Okay, so here we go. Communicating with your is so important, right? Always across the board, communication, communication, communication. So I'm going to brag on the team that I have right now at Kentucky Legal Aid in the Bowling Green office because I have such a great team now. I never get client calls saying that their attorneys are not communicating with them. And for those of you who are in a leadership position, that's huge. Like, it's so nice not to get those calls to say someone is not like communicating with them or they don't know what's going on with their case. So shout out to Bowling Green, Kentucky Legal Aid for making my job easier and I don't have to think about that. But you should always promptly inform your client, and this is Rule 3.130, 1.4a. A lawyer shall promptly inform the client of any decision or circumstance with respect to which the client's informed consent, as defined by Rule 1.0e, is required by these rules. Number 2. Reasonably consult with the client about the means by which the client's objectives are to be accomplished. You got to set forth those expectations. If you don't do that in your first meeting by covering expectations, I will tell you from personal experience, it's only going to go downhill or you're going to get 45 emails the next day from one client. Number 3, keep the client reasonably informed about the status of the matter. They should never hear from an adverse party first what's going to happen in court. When that happens, it's not good. So, always keep your client reasonably informed about the status of the matter. Number 4, promptly comply with reasonable requests and information. And number 5, consult with the client about any relevant limitation on the lawyer's conduct when the lawyer knows that the client expects assistance not permitted by the rules of professional conduct or other law. And a lawyer shall explain a matter to the extent reasonably necessary to permit the client to make informed decisions regarding the representation. So let's say your client files a FEMA appeal and they're like, if FEMA doesn't give me $7,000, my attorney's going to go in and they're going to do A, B, and C. They're going to take on FEMA because my attorney's that, I almost said a word I shouldn't. My attorney's that bad. Okay. So like they're amazing. And so that's not what you're going to do. You've got to communicate that expectation. So that's going to be more of a limited scope of representation. So you're going to come in, you're going to bring your FEMA appeal client in, and you're going to sign a retainer that manages their expectations. And what you're gonna do if the appeal is denied, how many times is that going to be denied before you cease representation? Or when the appeal is granted, is their case over with you? You're not going to help them with anything else. You've got to set that expectation of what's going to happen. When are you going to send them a closing letter with the anticipated FEMA response? Like, are you going to file the appeal and then close the case? They may not hear from FEMA for 90 days. And so what happens during that time period if it's denied again? Do they think that you're still going to represent them? And you can do any of these things. You've just got to set that expectation of what your role is going to be. And they need to understand that FEMA will contact them. FEMA will communicate with them directly. They're not going to receive that decision from the attorney. They will get that decision. So they need to know that as well. So they're not calling you every single day to say, have you heard from FEMA yet? No, I haven't, because you'll hear from them first. And so again, setting that expectation, and then schedule a FEMA response deadline to anticipate the client's return contact. So these are just some things that you can do to set forth that scope of representation if you're assisting someone with a FEMA appeal. Again, very important that you set these expectations at that very first meeting. And that meeting may take place in a DRC. It may take place anywhere, but you've got to be prepared for wherever you're meeting your disaster survivor, because in a disaster, you may be at the library, you may be in a pop-up tent somewhere meeting, but regardless of where you are, set that expectation. Next thing I want to talk about is declining or terminating representation. And there's a whole lot on here on this screen, but we're going to focus on, and this is rule 3.130, and then in parentheses 1.16. But we're going to talk about, except as stated in paragraph C, a lawyer may withdraw from representing a client if, and you'll see that this part is underlined, the client persists in a course of action involving the lawyer services that the lawyer reasonably believes is criminal or fraudulent, or the client has used the lawyer services to perpetrate a crime or fraud. Because guess what? As we know earlier from Whitney and Erica's presentation earlier, FEMA fraud is real. It happens. People see this carrot dangling in front of them of money, and they're in a situation where maybe they didn't have money before, or they're greedy and want to just say, like, I think it was in California, I heard about someone filing multiple claims for multiple homes in multiple people's names to try to defraud FEMA and just get some money. So it happens. Not saying look at all of your clients as if they're coming in trying to be fraudulent, because that's not the case. If you're crying with them one second, you're not going to accuse them of fraud the next. But fraud does happen. It is real. And if you find yourself in that circumstance, how do you get out of it? So you can decline or terminate your representation if you suspect that there is FEMA fraud. I'm going to go through the Supreme Court, the rules, and I know I had a little sign a while ago, but it says, except as stated in paragraph C, a lawyer may withdraw from representing a client if, number 2, the client persists in a course of action involving the lawyer's services that the lawyer reasonably believes is criminal or fraudulent, or the client has used the lawyer's services to perpetrate a crime or fraud. So if you find a client has attempted to or did defraud FEMA, you want to withdraw from representing them. Also, upon termination of representation, a lawyer shall take steps to the extent reasonably practicable to protect a client's interests, such as giving reasonable notice to the client, allowing time for employment of other counsel, surrendering papers and property to which the client is entitled, and refunding any advance payment or fee or expense that has not been earned or incurred. The lawyer may retain papers relating to the client to the extent permitted by other law. So when you decide to withdraw from representing someone because you suspect that there has been FEMA fraud, you kind of got to tell them. That's an awkward conversation. We don't like awkward conversations, but you have to tell them, this is why I'm withdrawing from representing you, and just the implications of fraud, like for FEMA recoupment. And so these are some examples of FEMA fraud. They have tried to sign a letter by a deceased person. So they're trying to get some money to repair Uncle Bob's property by saying it's theirs, but Uncle Bob, and signing his name, but Uncle Bob actually died like 2 years ago. Can't do that. They submitted an application for non-primary residents. So they didn't really live somewhere, but they're just trying to get some money because they stayed there sometimes. So we're going to try to see if we can file. No, you have to go through and make sure they're eligible or they meet the requirements for eligibility so that when they sign that document, you're not helping them to perpetrate that fraud. And again, spending FEMA assistance, if they say, okay, Christy, I'm going to get $5,000, I'm going to ask them for that. But there are these cute little Jimmy Choo shoes, which by the way, I did just see some for $300 that I'm not going to get, but it would be amazing if I did. But they're $800 and I'm going to use my money to buy those because they're really cute. And then they show you a picture. No, like you can't do that. So you cannot help them perpetrate the fraud. One of the things Whitney and I were talking about earlier, she's seen this. She thought that someone thought that they were eligible for FEMA, that they were getting funds, that the funds had already been issued. And they had called to put a stop payment on the FEMA check because for some reason they felt like they were going to get it, but now they hadn't gotten it yet. And I'm sorry, I'm not phrasing this right, Whitney. She's giving me a thumbs up, so maybe I am. And she was ready to cut them loose. Like, wait a second, you're not doing what you're supposed to. But then she had to dig deeper and they found out what was going on. So when I say don't help them perpetrate fraud, also dig a little bit and make sure that they're not intentionally doing that, because I don't know if you all can tell from this presentation that's been going on since 1 o'clock. FEMA is so confusing. FEMA is so helpful. So don't hear me say that it is not helpful. We are thankful for it. We are thankful when those funds are available to our clients, but it can be confusing to navigate even as attorneys. So if you suspect someone of fraud, dig in a little bit deeper and make sure that's actually what's happening and not just a misunderstanding of what's going on through the process. Diminished capacity client. You may have a client, their capacity is diminished. So in a FEMA appeal matter, the applicant or co-applicant is your client. And if you believe that there's a diminished capacity, seek information about power of attorney or guardianship. So if you have a client who's come in, you suspect that there's an issue, ask for those documents to ensure that you're providing those proper services. And I feel like I rushed through that a little bit, but I'm trying to make sure we get everything. Confidentiality. So important. And also one of the things that comes up a little bit, because what did I say a while ago? Everybody's asking you for information. And so as an attorney, I may have helped someone and I'm out working in the community. And then I have someone from Habitat for Humanity who says, hey, we've got these houses available. We can assist your client. Don't you represent John Smith? And I can't say, yes, I do. Give John a home. I can't do that. There are certain things that have to take place with confidentiality to protect the rights. Now, if I've got waivers, other things in the file, that was a very brief scenario, but there are ways that you're going to know if your client has something in the file in a disaster situation. But confidentiality. A lawyer shall not reveal information relating to the representation of a client unless the client gives informed consent. The disclosure is impliedly authorized, it should be implicitly, in order to carry out the representation or the disclosure is permitted. So it's permitted when there's informed consent by the client, there's a disclosure impliedly authorized, it's necessary to prevent certain death or substantial bodily harm, to secure ethics advice, to establish a defense against a claim by the client or respond in a disciplinary proceeding, or to comply with a court order. So that kind of goes through confidentiality of information as it relates to your clients. Again, Whitney and Erica mentioned earlier about FEMA. Records are maintained by FEMA. They're subject to the Privacy Act of 1974. Collection and use of information. Any information used in whole or in part in making a determination about an individual's rights, benefits, or privileges under FEMA programs will be collected directly from the subject individual to the extent practicable. The system manager shall also ensure that the information collected is used only in conformance with the provisions of the Act and these regulations. The website is underneath that. It's way too long for me to read, but you can Google that. You can find it. You can look at the slides later and research that a little bit more as to the condition and FEMA confidentiality. But no employee of FEMA shall disclose any record to any person or to any other agency without the express written consent of the subject individual unless the disclosure is, me read all of these. I got to get a little bit closer because I didn't wear my glasses. To a recipient who has provided FEMA with the advance adequate written assurance that their record will be used solely in statistical research or reporting, records subject to the following. The record shall be transferred in a form that is not individually identifiable. The written statement should include as a minimum 1, a statement of the purpose for requesting the records, and 2, the certification the records will be used only for statistical purposes. These written statements should be maintained as accounting records in addition to deleting personal identifying information from records released for statistical purposes. The system manager shall ensure that the identity of the individual cannot reasonably be deduced by combining various statistical records. A lot of information to say. FEMA keeps your records. They're not going to disclose that, but statistically, they may delete your information, your identifying information, and provide records, because you do hear sometimes that FEMA may have certain numbers and things like that. So I have a couple of more slides. I'm told that I'm out of time, so I'm going to rush through those really quickly, and I'm sorry. Okay. Oh, she's saying 10 minutes. Okay. All right. So that's okay. Okay. So confidentiality of information that includes identification like names and address. The privacy data cover sheet, appeals in physical folders. That's something that Whitney and Erica mentioned earlier. They showed you that appeal sheet. Authorization of the release of information under the Privacy Act form and additional release of information form if applicable. Sorry, make a noise again. Okay, so let me go backwards on that. So confidentiality of information. So all of these things are issues that may come up when if you're dealing directly with a FEMA client that you're helping them do a FEMA appeal. So really quickly, some other ethical issues that may arise when you're helping disaster survivors. The other party may not be represented. And so that person may contact you and say, thank you so much for helping us. Like I mentioned earlier, you may have to get a custody modification. So you may have filed paperwork. The adverse party calls you and was like, thanks so much for helping us. Like we couldn't hire an attorney. I'm so glad you're helping us. And they keep saying us, you're helping us. And then you just clearly say, I'm happy that I could file this action. Keep in mind, I only represent client A, and you need to hire an attorney. And if they tell you they're not going to, then you can negotiate to try to reach a settlement agreement. But you've got to make it very clear who you represent. You've got to always include that in your communication, especially in writing when you're settling a case. Another issue that may come up with disaster survivors, you may lose contact with them. That's just the reality. I know that happens with our own clients sometimes, that they stop communicating. They've decided not to go forward. But if you're dealing with a disaster client, guess what? They may have lost their job. They may have lost their home. They may have lost a loved one. There are so many aspects of what's going on in their life that they may just pick up and move. They may not think, they're not intentionally trying to evade you. They may just be like, I'm tired of being here. I'm going to start over in Tennessee. So they may move to Tennessee or wherever, and they may not communicate with, that with you. So you can't go forward and say, I'm still going to go ahead and settle this custody case because I know that's what they wanted. No. If you cannot communicate with your client, if you've lost that communication, ethically, you cannot and should not proceed in that representation. You've got to stop doing that because you've lost communication. So be mindful when you're speaking with unrepresented parties, and be mindful if you've lost contact with your client, how you should handle that. Okay, so becoming a volunteer, I think I can speak for every legal aid agency in the state of Kentucky, why it's so important to have volunteer attorneys, because after a disaster, that work is overwhelming. You have impacted individual after impacted individual after impacted individual who need assistance. And the volume of help that's needed surpasses an already overextended legal aid program, because you've just got more clients coming in and you've already been trying to figure out how you're helping the clients that you have now. And volunteer attorneys are so key. And it's also included in the rules. And, if it's a rule, you have to do it, right? So a lawyer's responsibilities. A lawyer, as a member of the legal profession, is a representative of clients and officer of the legal system and a public citizen having special responsibility for the quality of justice, i.e. representing disaster survivors. Paragraph 7, a lawyer should seek improvement of the law, access to the legal system, the administration of justice, and the quality of services rendered by the legal profession. I think that Okay. A lawyer should be mindful of the deficiencies in the administration of justice and the fact that the poor cannot always afford a legal assistance. And some of this is paraphrased, so I apologize. It's not written out completely, but you can look at 3.130 to see that. And therefore, all lawyers should devote professional time and resources and use civic influence to ensure equal access to our system of justice for all of those who, because of economic or social barriers, cannot afford or secure adequate legal counsel. So it's very important. It's nice to do the work that we do for those of us who are in the legal aid program. We know why we do what we do, but it's also impactful for those who are volunteer attorneys to say, I still I can give back too. Like I'm helping my clients and that's so wonderful. Like don't hear me say that that's not wonderful to be in the private bar, because obviously that's needed and we rely on the private bar so much to assist us, and appreciate the work that we do, because not everyone can qualify for legal aid. Who doesn't want something for low cost, no cost, right? But that demand is always greater than what the services are that we can provide. But a lawyer is encouraged to voluntarily render public interest legal service. A lawyer is encouraged to accept and fulfill this responsibility by rendering a minimum of 50 hours of service per calendar year, by providing professional services at no fee or at a reduced fee to persons of limited means, and or by financial support for organizations that provide legal services to persons of limited means. So volunteering, I can't say it enough, is so important. And I think through trainings like this and through other continuing legal education, if there's an area that a volunteer attorney doesn't know, there's always a space for an area that you do know. So if you say, well, I don't understand housing law. Well, that's okay if you don't understand housing law. We won't give you an eviction case, but you may understand custody law, and we're going to ask you to take this custody case. So I think I can speak again for all of the agencies and say, we're never going to give you a case that you're not comfortable taking, but the knowledge base that you have can always be used. So qualifications: all attorneys participating in Lawyers Care must be members of good standing of the Kentucky Bar Association. All volunteers are required to provide their KBA identification number and the date they became licensed, and an active status with the KBA is a prerequisite to serving as a volunteer attorney. So if you're listening to this and you're an attorney, you probably already have these 3 qualifications, right? So we want to make sure. And I kind of touched on this earlier, but there are so many areas that you can use your time. If you think, oh, well, that's not a disaster case, you've already heard housing, you've already heard custody, you've already heard domestic violence, you've already heard insurance. There's so many areas where services can be used. So such as employment law, unemployment law, educational law, collection issues, consumer issues, victims' rights like domestic violence cases, divorce cases, custody cases, housing cases, health and public benefits, elder law. All of these that are up here have a disaster or can have a disaster component as well. Impacting: it decreases child poverty by increasing self-sufficiency of low-income families. It can improve health care of impoverished children and other individuals. And again, while the word disaster is not on these screens, or on this screen particularly, all of these have that disaster component as well. So it can improve the quality of life of impoverished elderly and disabled individuals. As Whitney or Erica was saying earlier, talking about the ADA compliance and making sure FEMA pays for the items or reimburses for the items that are helping someone to survive that may be denied for somebody else. But if it's part of the ADA, then yes. So you want to be a part of that. It reduces domestic violence, protect low-income families and elderly individuals who have been victimized by fraud, financial abuse, or economic factors, because that can happen after a disaster as well. Someone can come in and try to take advantage of a family member or friend who maybe doesn't understand what happened, or is so much going on and have provided their information, and there's some financial abuse going on. And so can help stop that, and improve the quality of stability of housing for low-income families. So that's just some of the impact. That's not all. Volunteer opportunities. I know that Whitney has been doing the FEMA appeals clinics. There's another one, May the 6th. Is that what you said? Or May the 7th? May the 6th. Okay. So May the 6th. You may just be where you're giving counsel and advice. So important as well, just to say, you live in a UROLTA jurisdiction or you don't, and these are the housing laws if your home or your apartment has been damaged and your landlord is doing X, Y, and Z. You may actually do representation where you litigate and you go to court. You may be helping mediate a case. Pretty much, if it's the spectrum and in the wheelhouse of what you're doing now in your private practice, it can be in the spectrum and the wheelhouse of your volunteer services through the agencies. So, Kentucky Legal Aid covers the 35 counties in Western Kentucky. And I meant to throw a map up here that just shows you, but there are 3 other civil legal service providers, AppalReD, our host today, being one of them for Eastern Kentucky. There's also Legal Aid of the Bluegrass that kind of covers the Lexington, Covington area. And then there's Legal Aid Society that's kind of in the Louisville area and those surrounding counties. So if you're watching this today and you want to know more information about how you can volunteer with any of the legal aid programs, feel free to reach out. I think if you email directly through the registration information that you had, they can point you in the location of the agency that serves the county that you're volunteering. So that kind of takes me through. I think I did right at the 30-minute mark because I've got 4 minutes left and I started the ethics portion about 5 minutes early. So there you have it. But I'm so happy to take questions about any of the things that I've discussed today or just about disaster law in general before we get started on a separate Q&A section about everything that we've covered today. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about what you said about folks with diminished capacity. If you have a person who, if you're a volunteer attorney or a legal aid attorney for that matter, and you have somebody come in to meet with you at, the DRC or some clinic model or just in your office, and it's clear or you have high suspicion that they have diminished capacity. And I know you said ask for, dig a little deeper about power of attorney or guardianship. What if they don't have either, or maybe they don't have any family members helping them? What have you encountered that in your work with tornado survivors in Western Kentucky, or what would you recommend in those situations?
So the question was, what would you do? And I'm paraphrasing it. What would you do if someone you suspect that they have diminished capacity and there are not documents that show that someone is power of attorney or can be making decisions for them? And if I've experienced that in Western Kentucky. So I have not personally experienced that with disaster law in Kentucky. There have been a couple of instances where we've suspected that, and it may be a situation if we believe that able to represent this individual. The ombudsman program is housed in Kentucky Legal Aid. I may collaborate with them and, if we believe that this person is endangered or fraud on them, what is our responsibility about contacting adult protective services, things like that. And so I think that's a situation by situation. So I don't want to say blanket across the board, always contact adult protective services. But if someone has come in seeking assistance, somebody else is bringing them and you don't believe that they have the capacity, I don't think you can go forward. I'm going to sneeze. Sorry. You can't go forward in that representation because they don't have the capacity to enter into a retainer agreement with you or any type of counsel and advice agreement. But I think you have to maybe even get an ethics opinion on what your obligation is for ensuring that that person is not being taken advantage of. Any other questions? All right. Thank you all so much. I appreciate your time and attention today.
So if the folks online would give us just a moment, we're going to redesign the stage here and have our panelists come up for a Q&A session. If you have some specific questions, either related to the presentations or just things that have come up, other questions that you want to ask, now will be the time, and put them in the chat then. Okay, we're going to check the audio. Do you have your mic on
Hello.
up front? Okay, I'm the disembodied voice not sitting up there because it's a little crowded up there right now. So now we're going to have the question and answer session. So as I said before, if you have specific questions for them, I have a few here already that I've gathered from people in the room. So I'll go ahead and start with, can you all maybe just pass it down the line too? Can you talk about what are some of the most important things you think the volunteer attorneys should know about working with survivors of natural disasters, particularly in respect to um, lessons you've learned from? I know everybody has different disasters. The folks out in the West had the tornadoes, and Whitney, you dealt with the 2022 flood, and Erica, you're brand new to this space. But are there some things that you might share that you wish you would have known maybe that would be helpful to attorneys who are going to take on these cases and volunteer?
I accidentally hit a button.
Okay.
So is the volume on?
Can somebody that's online confirm that you can hear Whitney? Okay, thank you.
Wonderful.
Okay.
One of the things that I think is most important for volunteer attorneys to know and remember is that you are not alone. Practicing disaster law can sometimes feel very isolating because you will get your blinders on, or at least I have. Get your blinders on and you just want to go help the survivor. But again, it comes to that mental health aspect of your mental health matters too. So making sure that you stay connected, stay grounded, and know that there's a whole community out there, whether it's everyone sitting here on the stage or any of the other attorneys that you can connect with through some of the resources available on ladrc.org. And there's a lot of other disaster attorneys across the country that are amazing, and so experienced. So you're not alone. If you don't know the answer, that's okay. There's someone that probably has experienced that and can get you connected. So that would be my answer.
Like Angie said, I'm pretty new to the disaster world, but one thing I've dealt with here recently with current declared disaster is we all know as attorneys that people can be a little bit distrustful of attorneys. And when you're working with so much federal assistance, you run into people who are also distrustful of the government. And this kind of goes along with what Christy said about not endorsing your client's political views by their representation, things like that. Just emphasizing that, at the end of the day, FEMA is here to help you. They're going to try to give you the money that you need. And we're here to help you too. And, you're not obligated to take any kind of assistance, and we'll help you get whatever it is you want in any way that we can. But, trying to create that atmosphere of trust between yourself and the client and the outside entities that you're working with.
So just a couple of things on that topic. I think first and foremost is communication. If you're volunteering your services, we want to know for sure what areas you want to volunteer in so that you're not placed with a type of an area of law that you're not comfortable with. So I think it's very clear in your communication up front as a volunteer attorney if this is my specialty. So this is the area that I want to offer my services in, and that I guarantee you that we will have a case that we can find for the particular area of law that you want to practice. Also, community resources. If you have a disaster client who has been impacted, there are so many services and communities of agencies, individuals who want to help. And if you don't know what those are, your legal aid attorneys will know, or the legal aid staff will know what those are, and just kind of get out in the community a little bit and speak with other agencies, other community resources, faith-based organizations. 9 times out of 10, there are funds available that may not meet your client's needs or may not serve a particular area that your client is facing, but there's going to be something that will help them in addition to the legal service that you can offer.
In case you're wondering, this is my 6-year-old. It is our spring break right now, so this is his spring break travel. That's why he's here to assist. But I think I've probably worked in the disaster space less than my other 3 co-presenters. I think something that's really hard that we've talked about is like people have really traumatic stories, and like I think that can be true across the board anytime you're working with any client, but I think especially a lot of our clients have just had one horrible thing after the next happen to them. A lot of things that are kind of exacerbated by the fact that they are very poor. And I often have people tell me, you're the first attorney that's listened to me. You're the first person that's talked to me about this. Even when I'm telling them bad news, like there's nothing I can do to help you. This is what your rights are. It's empowering for them to have that information to know how they can go forward, even if it's not the news they want to hear. So like you want to be like have a nice bedside manner when delivering horrible news. But I think it's surprising how much people feel better and feel heard when you sit and are empathetic and listen to their story and then just tell them, I'm so sorry you're experiencing this. Here's what the law says. And my circle back to that is it's not my job to make you feel better. It's my job to tell you what the law is. And I'm really sorry that the law is not on your side, because if you're dealing with housing issues, that's generally going to be the case. But I think just remembering that these are people too, and hearing them and validating that they're feeling their feelings of hopelessness or frustrations are very real and alive, and you want to help them through that. Even if you can't solve all their problems, it's a huge value to people to have someone in a position of power like an attorney listening to them and validating their feelings.
Okay, our next question is being mindful of the importance of not misusing FEMA funds. How should serious needs assistance funds be spent?
You can spend serious needs assistance right away on anything that you need help with immediately after a disaster. Whether that's gas to go to your parents' house, to replace any essential needs like medication, breastfeeding supplies, baby formula, food, all of those things. Just anything that is essential to you in that very immediate aftermath of the disaster. You can spend that $770 on that.
Another question is, if a landlord can't get FEMA assistance for a property they don't live in, and a renter can't get FEMA assistance for a place they rent, is there any avenue to get assistance to repair rental property? I don't know who has thoughts on that.
I do. Okay. So landlords are generally not eligible for FEMA assistance unless they live in the disaster damaged property. There will be opportunities for landlords to seek low interest disaster loans through the Small Business Administration. And then there also might be some opportunities through the CDBGDR. I got that acronym down. It took me forever to practice it out loud. So it's the Community Block Development Grant for Disaster Recovery, CDBGDR. There might be some opportunities to get some financial assistance through that for landlords, or you could also go through a private lender. I know that's not the best option or ideal, but that's just how FEMA assistance works. Renters generally are eligible for personal property assistance or other types of other needs assistance and rental assistance. So there are options for renters. They're just a little bit more limited as far as the housing assistance side goes.
One thing I just want to remind everyone really quick too is some renters have rental insurance. I have renter's insurance because I was required to get it in my lease. FEMA's going to want to see that renter's insurance denial letter before they will give you other needs assistance. So you need to file a claim with your renter's insurance. It probably doesn't cover flood damage, but they're going to want to see that denial letter.
I have another question here that asks, what do you do if your client comes in, says they've been denied by FEMA, but they have no documents? Do you wait to file the appeal, or can you separately submit the documents at a later date?
So with that 60-day appeal window that you really want to try to stick to, and mind you, there's a tiny bit of flexibility so long as you put a reason in there of why you're submitting an appeal letter late. We have absolutely sent in appeal letters for folks who come in. I haven't been able to find a contractor, but you know, my FEMA inspector came out. What can I do? I haven't gotten my estimate yet. Whatever the situation is, you can still submit that appeal letter and just put FEMA on notice of I'm working on it. It's been difficult. You can include that in your letter. But you want to keep that appeal timeline rolling. So submit what you do have, or at least let FEMA know you're working on it. Communication is key. And then that 60-day deadline on you to respond bounces back to FEMA's court for a 90-day response deadline on them. And then you can always supplement information. So even if you don't have supporting documents right then, you will have time within that 18-month period of assistance to work with an attorney, work with family members or other advocates in your community to gather whatever information you need to have a more successful chance at an appeal.
So I have not personally encountered that, but I think as Whitney mentioned earlier, you can request the case file from FEMA. So if in the past they had made claims and they had provided those documents, then they would be able to have access to those again. But I've not personally had to deal with that, but I just think that like let's say that there was a tornado and then another tornado, things like that. You request those documents. If you don't have them at the time of the appeal deadline, just file something saying that they've been requested. I wholeheartedly agree with Whitney that you've got to keep that rolling. So if you're hitting that 60-day window, you still don't have everything that you need. File what you do have, put a statement in there of what's coming. So that way it's not denied for not being timely filed.
So one of the things that Whitney and I have been able to both participate in this disaster is the Kentucky statewide VOAD meetings. Oh, so the are we good?
Can you hear us? Okay.
Okay.
Can you repeat that question, Eric, or do you want me to repeat it now? I think I'm back. Am I back on? Yeah.
Yeah, if you could repeat the question.
Okay. The question is around community partners and resource referrals. And the question is, how can we assist with short-term needs aside from lodging immediately after disaster? For instance, food, diapers, shoes, etc. Will the DRCs have organizations to assist with these things? And how long after disaster will these types of non-financial assistance be available?
So one of the things that Whitney and I have been able to participate in during this disaster are these statewide VOAD meetings. VOAD stands for Volunteer Organizations Active in Disaster. And each state has a VOAD, and then there's a national VOAD kind of cohort. So we had continuous VOAD meetings every weeknight for the first, I believe, 3 weeks after the Valentine's Day flooding started. So on those nightly meetings, they were kind of like coordinating calls, and all of these agencies, you would be shocked, from all around the country just swept in to help us. We had, and these are kind of nonprofits that focus on the immediate needs, right? Like Crisis Cleanup is a nonprofit who goes around and just helps people like clean up their debris and stuff like that. We have the barbecue food truck that comes around to disaster areas, and just all kinds of people who really want to help our disaster survivors in a non-legal way. So going on those calls, you know, getting those resource lists from those calls, getting contact information, and we can provide that to you all We always keep good record of that so that if another disaster were to happen and you all immediately jump in and start volunteering with us, we can provide those lists to you. We maybe even be able to get you on, a VOA call one night or something like that. So yeah, that's one of the first ways that the entire area starts to kind of organize and cohort around immediate needs.
Red Cross is also another organization that will always come in after a disaster and help with some of those immediate needs. There will be distribution centers set up throughout any impacted county, even before a declaration. So I think it was Monday the 17th, I'd gone to the Floyd County Community Center, and St. Vincent Mission was there with some representatives from the Floyd County Long-Term Recovery Group. I recall that Pike County, they have an amazing long-term recovery group. Sandy Penix is great, and she rock star. She's on top of it. And there are just so many. I'm of course forgetting a lot of organizations right now, but there are so many that will kind of swoop in, do what they can to respond to those immediate needs, try to get lists going. Facebook has been a huge way for clients and these organizations to communicate with each other of what are the needs and can we kind of relocate some of these needs if one county is getting more donations than another and they need a supplement. Everybody works together, and we've unfortunately gotten better at working together because this is such a fresh disaster, or a close disaster to July 22, but little bit better coordinated this time, and we're getting somewhere.
What would you say the biggest challenges are for you all as attorneys working in this space, this disaster legal services space?
So I will just say for me personally, starting out as a disaster response attorney is areas of law that I had not been familiar with in practicing. So educating myself, bringing in resources, bringing in others to not only help me, but to help the other disaster response attorneys at Kentucky Legal Aid to understand the areas of law that we may not be as familiar with. So if I would just say, as a volunteer attorney, if you don't feel like you've got the bandwidth to take on a case, you can always reach out to your legal aid agency and say, you know what, I'm really skilled at insurance law. I'm really skilled at property law. I would be able to come in and do a presentation to your agency so you all better understand this area of law. If you feel like that's something that you can do, if you don't have, like I said, the bandwidth to take on something else. And so for me personally, that's been very helpful. Just kind of bringing in someone else to teach me what I didn't already know. So that would probably be my biggest challenge, is admitting that I don't know something, but also bringing in the help for that. And I've never had I've never had an attorney turn me down when I've asked them to explain something to me or to help our agency understand better. But that would be, as a legal aid attorney, what a challenge would be, but also maybe as a volunteer attorney, if again, going back to communicating what cases you're comfortable taking. But for me, that was an issue.
I think Christy already talked about this a little bit earlier, but during the tornadoes in Bowling Green, like we had several people in the Bowling Green office who were displaced from their home, and then like having to deal with this at home and then also going to work and deal with it, I think is really difficult. And I haven't really personally had to experience that yet. But I think it's definitely a possibility and coming. And I think we just had like a couple weeks ago really bad hail in Owensboro, and 3 of the people in our office, their cars were totaled and all their windows were crashed in. And so it's like, you don't have a vehicle, but you still have to go to work and do this job. And it's just like that can be true for everybody in town, right? But like we're on the front lines trying to help these people do it. And like this week I'm on the board of this homeless shelter, and we 2 days ago, which I'm like preparing to come to the other side of the state, are like, oh, we need sandbags. The building's going to flood. And so it's just like things that you maybe that are also happening in your personal life that you have to deal with and help with to prepare your own family and your own things at home, and then also come to work and deal with the same thing. And that can be true with things beyond disaster. But I think this really, it becomes very obvious, the challenges, and like really can impact your own ability to actually do your job.
One challenge for me on a very personal level was getting past that imposter syndrome. Learning that it's okay to just pull a seat up to the table if you weren't invited, especially if it's a space you really need to be in. From July 22, I just did my best to dig in and see what organizations or Kentucky Emergency Management or FEMA folks, what are you all doing? I would talk to them at the disaster recovery centers and just ask if I could get a meeting invite. And now I have an abundance of meeting invites, but it's always really helpful to just put yourself out there. It's okay. It's a little scary at first, but getting through that, it's important and helpful for the disaster survivors is the key there.
Okay, so one final question. We've been talking all day about helping people who are currently impacted by a natural disaster, and particularly attorneys who volunteer to help those folks. What are things that you think that once the disaster has passed, attorneys should share with their own clients on how to prepare for the next disaster, because we all know there's going to be another one, as we see them over and over again. So what are things that attorneys should know to prepare their own clients for the next disaster?
So that's something that we're currently trying to work with 2022 flood survivors with estate planning. I couldn't think of the word for a minute. Estate planning, having a will, having a power of attorney, having a funeral planning declaration. We don't want to think about that aspect of disaster, of disaster recovery, because we want to see recovery as, a happy ending, but you want to know, that if something were to happen to you, that your family would understand your wishes. But also that can help when it comes to like title clearing, because like we said earlier, especially in rural areas, properties are often passed down for generations without any documentation whatsoever. So like just having like a holographic will that meets the statutory requirements, of course, can really help your descendants, if they were to be a disaster survivor one day. FEMA can look at that will and understand that they own that property, and that could be the difference between them getting all the FEMA money and none of the FEMA money. So estate planning is the one that I would emphasize.
I think it's important as you're working with your clients now is just focusing on preserving documents. So if you have any type of court order that you're giving them, just encourage them to make a digital copy of it and to put it in a safe place with their other documents so that they always know that it's in like a fireproof, waterproof container or document holder. If you're doing a property closing, just encourage them to take photographs of their new home, photographs of all their property, and all of that, just ways that you can work those things in. So if something did happen later on down the road, then they've already got a story of what was in their home just by those pictures that you have encouraged them to take after they've gotten into their new home and they set up. So I think whatever type of law you're practicing, you can still find a way to work in preserving those documents or in those protected cases and folders and things that you can buy safes to make sure that they have access to them later if there is a disaster.
I'm going to piggyback off of both of those. For documents, I kind of talked about this. Like, it's really important to have a copy of your lease agreement if you're a renter, and that's going to be important for evictions, and it could also be important for your rental insurance if you have it. In my experience, most of my clients don't have rental insurance, but a lease agreement is super important. Encourage your clients, anytime you have any housing client in your office, take a picture of your lease and save it to your Google Drive, your iCloud, whatever they use. Or send me a copy of your lease agreement in your email right now, and then it's in my email because they're going to lose it. Also, for estate planning purposes, it's amazing how many people lose a family member and then just continue paying the mortgage. And so they're paying the mortgage, but the property's not in their name. And so we have a really easy way to fix that in Kentucky with an affidavit of descent. It's a super easy document. If you ever need a copy of one of those for a sample, I'm happy to provide one. But then that can be recorded, and then it is like the will, but it also makes it officially recorded, and then they're survivor in interest for the mortgage company, and they can be evaluated to assume that loan moving forward, which may or may not be important in the disaster context, but can really help them stabilize their own housing situation, because it's always going to be precarious if they're just paying someone else's mortgage and that person has passed away.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for your time today. And that concludes the panel presentation. I'm going to turn this over for a moment. If you all want to exit the stage, I'm going to turn this over to the turning this over to Charnel Burton, the directing attorney of our pro bono project.
Hi. So as you can hear from everything that was presented today, we need your help. We can't do this by ourselves. We need attorneys from all over the state, not only for our clients here in the AppalReD service area, but for KLA's clients and other clients all over the state who have experienced or will experience a disaster. And if you have an hour, we can fill that hour. If you have 50 hours that you want to volunteer, we can fill 50 hours of volunteer work. If you want to take a case, you know, if you have an expertise in mortgage law or insurance law or bankruptcy, and you want to actually take a case and represent a client, we've got cases that we can give you. If you just want to come to a clinic, we're going to be having our next FEMA clinic May 6th at the Harlan Depot in Harlan County. We would love to have you there to help us help clients appeal FEMA denials. We're going to be having other clinics throughout the year. We want to have some virtual clinics. So if you can't physically come to one of our clinics, we're going to set up a virtual option so that no matter where you are, you can participate. So if you would just let us know if you've signed up for this. There was a volunteer application at the end of the registration form. Hopefully you filled that out. If you didn't, there's another volunteer application form on our website, www.ardfky.org. You can call my office. Our number is 606-886-3876. Call us. We can get you signed up. We'll be happy to work with anybody who wants to work with us to help our clients. We do approximately 25, 26 clinics throughout the year. This year, I have a feeling we're going to be doing more than that, and they're not all just going to be FEMA clinics. And then, you know, if you've got a particular area of the law that you're interested in, but you don't have the expertise, let us know. We have experts within our organizations that can piggyback with you. They can mentor you. You can mentor us if you know something about insurance law or something that we don't know about. We're happy to do that. But please give us a call, and thank you very much. Oh, we have these cool t-shirts that we'll give you. If you sign up to take cases with us, you can be part of our pro bono team. So thank you.